Chapter 1. The Weight of Dreams. Faramir woke in the darkness of his chamber, with the taste of prophecy still bitter on his tongue. The dream clung to him like smoke from a quenched candle. Impossible to shake, impossible to ignore. 3 times now. 3 times the same words had found him in sleep, spoken in voices that carried the weight of ages. Seek for the sword that was broken. In Imladris, it dwells. He sat up in his narrow bed, running a hand through dark hair, dampened with sweat. The stone walls of his chamber in the citadel seemed to press closer in the pre-dawn gloom, as if the very foundations of Minas Tirith were listening. Through the casement window, the first pale light of June crept across the horizon, but it brought no comfort. Only the certainty that something had changed in the night, something that would not let him rest. The words of the dream echoed in his mind with crystalline clarity. There shall be counsels taken, stronger than Morgul spells. There shall be shown a token that doom is near at hand. He had pored over every scroll in the houses of healing, every fragment of lore in his father's archives, but Imladris remained a name shrouded in mystery. He knew it only from the oldest texts, a hidden refuge, somewhere far to the north. The dwelling place of Lord Elrond Half-Elven, if the stories could be trusted. Faramir rose and moved to the window, his bare feet silent on the cold stone. Below, the city slept, but he could feel the weight of waking thoughts pressing against his consciousness. Someone else stirred in the early morning, someone whose sleep had been broken by the same burden. His brother. The tap on his door came moments later, soft but insistent. Faramir. Boromir's voice carried through the oak, careful not to wake the household, but heavy with purpose. I know you are awake. He opened the door to find his brother already dressed, mail glinting beneath a simple cloak. Boromir's face was grim, marked by the same sleepless night that had claimed them both. 5 years Faramir's senior, Boromir had always carried himself with the confidence of heir apparent, but now uncertainty creased his weathered features. You had the dream again, Boromir said. It was not a question. The 3rd time. Faramir stepped aside, allowing his brother to enter the chamber. The words grow stronger each night, more insistent, as if something seeks to draw me north with increasing urgency. Boromir closed the door behind him and leaned against it, studying Faramir's face in the growing light. I have had it but once, yet it haunts my waking hours as thoroughly as it plagued my sleep. The riddle of it gnaws at me, brother. What is this sword that lies broken? What doom draws near that requires such counsel? Faramir moved to the simple desk where his books lay scattered, parchments covered with his careful notes and sketches. I have traced every reference I can find. Imladris is real, a hidden valley beyond the misty mountains, where the elves maintain one of their last great refuges in Middle-earth. Lord Elrond dwells there, keeper of one of the 3 rings, holder of ancient wisdom. He touched a weathered map with his fingertip. The journey would be perilous. The roads through the wild are forgotten, watched by enemies. It is not a path for the unwary. Which is precisely why I must take it. Boromir's voice carried the finality of decision already made. You are too precious to risk on such an errand, brother. Father has need of your wisdom here, especially with darkness gathering on our borders. I will ride to this Imladris and learn what counsel the dream commands. Faramir turned from the desk, and in that moment Boromir saw something he had not expected in his younger brother's eyes. Not relief, not gratitude, but quiet, implacable resolve. No, Faramir said simply. The dreams come to me, Boromir. 3 times they have called, and each time with greater insistence. I am the one who must answer. You speak of dreams as if they were orders from the steward himself. Boromir pushed away from the door, his mail rustling with the movement. Dreams can deceive, brother. They can lead the unwary into darkness and despair. I have seen battle, walked among the enemy's servants, felt the weight of their malice. This journey requires a warrior, not a scholar. And I have walked among the suffering in the houses of healing, read the lore of our people until my eyes burned, studied every account of the enemy's return until I knew his strategies as well as any captain. Faramir's voice remained calm, but steel had entered it, the same steel that had made him a leader of the Rangers, despite his father's preference for his brother. This is not merely a matter of reaching a destination, Boromir. Something in these dreams calls specifically to me. The words speak of counsels and tokens, and a doom that requires understanding, not just sword skill. Boromir studied his brother's face, seeing the depth of conviction there, and felt an old familiar weight settle on his shoulders, the weight of protection, of responsibility for the one person in Gondor he could not bear to lose. You ask me to let you ride into unknown lands, through territories crawling with orcs and worse, to seek an elven lord who may not even receive you? Father will never permit it. Father values wisdom as much as valor, Faramir replied, though they both knew this was only partially true. And he knows that some battles cannot be won with swords alone. If this prophecy speaks truly, if some great counsel is indeed to be taken that may turn the tide of our long war, then we cannot afford to approach it with anything less than complete understanding. The brothers stood facing each other in the growing light, each seeing in the other's eyes the weight of choice that could not be unmade. Boromir saw the scholar who had become a warrior through necessity, whose gentle nature masked a will as strong as any blade. Faramir saw the protector who had borne the burden of being heir and elder brother with unfailing courage, whose strength had always stood between their family and every shadow. If something happens to you, Boromir said quietly, if the road takes you or the enemy's servants find you, I will carry that failure to my grave. And if I do not answer this call, if I let fear keep me from the path that duty demands, I will carry that cowardice forever. Faramir's hand found his brother's shoulder. You taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, Boromir. It is doing what must be done despite the fear. The dreams call to me, not to you. This is my burden to bear. Boromir was quiet for a long moment, his hand moving to rest over Faramir's where it lay on his shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of acceptance and love and worry that could not be separated from each other. Then we must speak with Father. And if he consents to this madness, you will not travel unprepared. The Rangers know the roads north better than any. You will take their guidance, their protection. Promise me that much. I promise. Faramir's relief was carefully contained, but Boromir could see it in the relaxing of his shoulders, the way his breathing deepened slightly. Though I suspect Father's consent will not come easily. Leave Father to me, Boromir said, straightening with the bearing of a captain preparing for a difficult battle. He may listen to reason when it comes wrapped in tactical assessment. You are the more learned in lore, better suited to interpret whatever riddles the elves may speak. And if this doom truly approaches, we need every advantage wisdom can provide. As the sun climbed higher beyond the window, the brothers stood together in the growing light, each knowing that something fundamental had shifted between them. The protected had chosen to venture into danger, and the protector had chosen to let him go. The weight of that choice would follow them both down, whatever paths lay ahead. Neither could have imagined, in that moment, how completely their world was about to change. Chapter 2. The Road to Rivendell. The archives of Minas Tirith had not seen such thorough scrutiny in decades. Faramir spent the 3 days following his father's reluctant consent buried among maps and manuscripts that had gathered dust since the glory days of Gondor's Reach, where Boromir might have gathered sword and shield and ridden north with little more than instinct to guide him. Faramir approached his journey like a scholar, preparing for the most crucial examination of his life. The ranger paths through the lone lands are marked here, he murmured to himself, his finger tracing faded ink across a map older than his grandfather. But this suggests a ford across the Horwell that may no longer exist. The morning light slanted through the high windows of the archive chamber, illuminating centuries of accumulated knowledge that suddenly felt desperately relevant. Denethor had given his consent with the grim acceptance of a man sending his son into almost certain death. "You have 3 months," the steward had said, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair. "If this counsel the dreams speak of has not materialized by the turning of the season, you will return. Gondor cannot spare both her sons to the shadows of prophecy." Now, as Faramir rolled the precious maps into oiled leather cases, he carried the weight of that deadline alongside everything else. 3 months to find a hidden valley, gain audience with an elven lord whose very existence was more legend than fact, and return with whatever wisdom might turn the tide of their long war. Boromir would have considered such preparation a waste of precious time. Faramir considered it the difference between success and becoming another mystery lost to the wild roads. The Captain General of the Rangers of Ithilien knocked softly on the archive door as Faramir secured the last of his research. Damrod entered with the careful step of one accustomed to moving silently through hostile territory, his weathered face creased with concern. "My lord," Damrod said, offering a formal bow that carried genuine respect. "The men are ready, as you requested, though I confess, sending you beyond our borders sits ill with every ranger under my command." Faramir looked up from his preparations, noting the way Damrod's hand rested unconsciously on his sword hilt. "Your misgivings are noted and understood, my friend. But this is not a mission for a company of rangers, where armed men might provoke the very dangers we seek to avoid. A small party traveling with scholarly purpose may find paths that remain closed to warriors. Scholarly purpose will not turn aside orc arrows or warg fangs," Damrod replied bluntly. "The roads north of the Misty Mountains haven't grown safer with the passage of years, my lord. If anything, they have grown darker, which is why I value your counsel." Faramir moved to a detailed map of the northern approaches, one marked with his own careful annotations. "Tell me of the eastern routes through Rudor. Your rangers have scouted there. What manner of settlements might offer aid to travelers claiming scholarly purpose?" Damrod studied the map with the focused attention of a man whose life had depended on such details. "Here," he pointed to a marking near the east road. "The village of Arshay, small, isolated, but their headman served as a soldier in his youth. He knows the value of information and might be persuaded to aid one who brings news from the south." His finger moved north. "Further on there are farmsteads scattered through the Chetwood, Bree folk, mostly, who prefer their isolation, but remember their debts to those who treat them with respect. And beyond Bree, the Forsaken Inn stands at the crossing of the East Road and the road to Rivendell, if the old songs speak truly of such a road. But my lord," Damrod's voice carried a warning, "past that point, our knowledge grows thin. The rangers who have ventured into those lands speak of watched ways, of paths that seem to shift when no one looks directly upon them. Elven work, perhaps, or something darker." Faramir nodded slowly, committing every detail to memory. Then we must rely on more than maps and martial strength. I will carry letters of scholarly introduction, proof of my interest in the ancient lore of the North. Where suspicion might greet warriors, curiosity may welcome a keeper of knowledge. Damrod remained silent for a moment, studying the younger man's face. In 5 years of serving under both brothers, he had learned to read the differences between them. Boromir's plans carried the weight of certainty, as if will alone could force the world to comply with his intentions. Faramir's carried the patience of deep roots, as if he understood that some victories required growing rather than seizing. "There is another matter, my lord," Damrod said finally. "Word has reached us that Saruman's Uruks have been seen in greater numbers along the western approaches to the Misty Mountains. They seem to be searching for something, or someone. If your journey becomes known to them, then we must ensure it does not." Faramir rolled up the map and secured it with the others. "I will travel with a small company, appearing as nothing more than a scholar seeking old books and older stories. Let the enemy's servants look for armies and heroes. They may overlook a dusty academic with more interest in ancient poems than present wars." The irony was not lost on either man. Faramir, whose prowess with sword and bow had earned him respect among the rangers despite his scholarly nature, would now lean entirely on that scholarship for protection. Where Boromir would have trusted to steel and strength, Faramir would trust to wisdom and the hope that knowledge could open doors that force could not. 2 days later, as the first light of dawn painted the Pelennor fields in shades of gold, a small party rode out through the gates of Minas Tirith. Faramir travelled with only 3 companions, Mablung, his most trusted ranger, and a man whose steady competence had seen him through countless missions in enemy territory. Anborn, young but sharp-eyed, and possessed of an uncanny ability to read the intentions of wild beasts and wilder men. And Beregond, a guard of the citadel, whose knowledge of languages and letters had made him invaluable in diplomatic missions. They rode not with the purposeful urgency that would have marked Boromir's departure, but with the measured pace of scholars who understood that haste bred carelessness, and carelessness bred death. Faramir had planned their route with meticulous care, avoiding the most direct paths in favor of roads that would take them through settlements where a curious academic might reasonably stop to examine local traditions and historical sites. The first test of his approach came 3 weeks into their journey, as they crested a ridge overlooking the village of Arche. Smoke rose from cook fires in the small settlement below, and Faramir could see figures moving between the scattered buildings with the unhurried pace of people following familiar routines. But there was something else, the glint of metal among the trees beyond the village, and the way some of those figures moved with the purposeful stride of men accustomed to weapons. "Armed men in the woods," Mablung observed quietly, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "Could be brigands, could be worse. Lord Boromir would likely counsel a wide circuit around the village." Faramir studied the scene below with the careful attention he had once brought to parsing difficult texts. Or they could be the village's own defenders, posted as sentries against the very dangers that concern us. If we circle wide, we learn nothing and gain no advantage. If we approach openly, as scholars with legitimate business, we may discover both the nature of their vigilance and the reason for it. Anborn shifted uneasily in his saddle. "And if they prove hostile, my lord? We are but 4 against unknown numbers." "Then we retreat," Faramir said simply, "but not before we have tested whether honest purpose may open doors that suspicion would keep barred." He guided his horse down the slope toward the village, his companions falling in behind him, with the disciplined trust of rangers who had learned to follow their captain's judgment even when they questioned his tactics. As they approached the outskirts of Archet, figures emerged from the tree line. Not brigands, Faramir noted with relief, but village men with the weathered faces and practical dress of farmers who had learned to bear arms in defense of their homes. The eldest of them, a grizzled man with a sergeant's bearing despite his simple clothes, stepped forward to meet them. His hand rested on his sword hilt, but his stance spoke of caution rather than hostility. "Good day to you, travelers," the man said, his eyes taking quick inventory of their arms and equipment. "I am Hal Whitbrook, elected to speak for Archet in matters concerning the safety of our people. Your business in our lands?" Faramir dismounted, offering a respectful bow that acknowledged the man's authority without subservience. "Good day, Master Whitbrook. I am Faramir of Gondor, keeper of certain lore and seeker of knowledge concerning the ancient histories of the North. We travel to examine sites of historical interest and to consult with learned men regarding the old songs and stories of these lands." Whitbrook's expression shifted slightly, suspicion giving way to curiosity. "Gondor, you say? That's a long road to travel for old stories. What manner of lore brings men from the White City to our modest village?" "The lore of the elder days," Faramir replied, producing from his pack a carefully prepared scroll covered with copied verses and notations. "The songs speak of great events in these northern lands, battles fought, alliances forged, wisdom preserved in hidden places. Much has been lost in the south, and I hope to recover what knowledge remains in the keeping of northern folk." The scroll itself was authentic, hours of Faramir's careful work copying fragments of ancient poetry and historical references. But its true purpose was not scholarship. It was a key that might unlock doors that remained closed to obvious military missions. Whitbrook examined the scroll with the respect of a man who had learned to value written knowledge, even if he could not pass all its meanings. "Aye, there are old stones hereabouts, and older stories. My grandmother knew songs of the kings that were, and of roads that led to places now lost." He looked up at Faramir with something approaching approval. It's been many years since anyone came asking after such things. Most travelers these days come seeking shorter roads or easier fights. "Knowledge is often the longest road but the surest destination," Faramir replied. "Would you be willing to share what your people remember? I would be honored to hear the stories your grandmother preserved, and to record them with the honor they deserve." And so it was that Faramir of Gondor spent an evening by the fires of Archet, listening to village elders recite fragments of ancient song, while his rangers shared news from the south and warned of movements in the wild that might threaten isolated settlements. Where Boromir might have pressed on with barely a pause for supplies, Faramir built bridges of knowledge and respect that would be remembered long after he had passed. When they departed the next morning, it was with accurate information about the roads ahead, warnings about which paths had grown dangerous, and the knowledge that they would find welcome in other villages that maintained contact with Archet. More importantly, they carried with them the understanding that sometimes the longest path proves swifter than the shortest route. As they rode north toward the distant mountains, Faramir reflected on the difference between the journey he was taking and the one his brother would have made. Boromir would have reached this point perhaps a week sooner, but he would have traveled it as a stranger, armed and watchful, gathering no allies and leaving no friends behind. Faramir traveled more slowly, but he traveled as one who understood that even the smallest knowledge might prove the key to the greatest door. The road to Rivendell stretched ahead, unknown and perilous, but it no longer stretched friendless. Chapter 3. The Council of Elrond. The morning of October the 25th dawned clear and cold in Rivendell, with a quality of light that seemed to make every leaf and stone appear more substantial, more real than such things had any right to be. Faramir stood on the terrace overlooking the valley, breathing air that tasted of ancient wisdom and timeless peace, and felt the weight of his dreams finally beginning to settle into understanding. 3 days he had been in the hidden valley, 3 days of wonder that had justified every hardship of the journey north. Lord Elrond had received him with a courtesy that spoke of genuine respect for his scholarly pursuits, and their conversations had revealed depths of knowledge that made Faramir feel like a child, comparing pebbles to mountains. Yet there had been something in the Elf Lord's manner, a watchful gravity that suggested larger purposes than the exchange of historical lore. Now, as he made his way through corridors that seemed to have grown from living stone, Faramir carried with him the summons that had come with the dawn. "The time for council has arrived," Elrond's messenger had said simply. "You are invited to attend, son of Gondor, for your journey here was not wrought by chance." The chamber where the council convened was open to the sky, set within a pavilion whose pillars seemed to frame the morning light itself. Already assembled were figures that would have seemed the stuff of legend to most men of Gondor. Elrond, half-elven, in robes that shifted between silver and grey, an elf of the woodland realm whose golden hair caught the light like spun starfire, a dwarf whose bearing spoke of mountain kingdoms and ancient pride, and at the centre of it all, a grey-cloaked wizard whose eyes held depths that Faramir recognized from his father's most bitter moods, though tempered here with something that might have been hope. But it was the small figure seated between the wizard and Lord Elrond that drew Faramir's attention most completely. A hobbit, travel-worn, and bearing himself with a gravity that seemed too large for his diminutive frame. At his feet lay a bundle wrapped in cloth, and from it emanated something that made Faramir's scholarly instincts recoil with immediate visceral understanding. "Be welcome, Faramir of Gondor," Elrond said, gesturing to a place prepared for him. "Your arrival here fulfills prophecy spoken long ago, though not in the manner we might have expected." As Faramir took his seat, his eyes met those of a man who sat somewhat apart from the others, a ranger by his dress and bearing, though there was something in his face that spoke of kings and ancient bloodlines. The man inclined his head with careful respect, and Faramir found himself wondering what stories lay behind those grey eyes. "Before we begin," Elrond continued, his voice carrying the weight of ages, "know that what is spoken here must not pass beyond this circle. The fate of all the free peoples may hang upon the counsel we take this day." "I understand, my lord," Faramir replied, though he suspected his understanding was yet incomplete. "I come seeking the counsel mentioned in the dreams that have plagued my sleep, though I confess the riddle of them remains opaque to me." Gandalf leaned forward, his weathered features creased with something between relief and sorrow. "The riddle shall be made plain, son of Denethor. But first, we must speak of treachery and courage, of roads taken and prices paid." His eyes found the hobbit. "Frodo, the tale must be told, and it is yours to tell." What followed was a recounting that left Faramir's scholarly mind reeling with implications he had never dared to imagine. The hobbit, Frodo Baggins, spoke with quiet precision of a ring discovered, a wizard's warnings, a journey from the Shire through perils that would have broken lesser hearts. But it was when Gandalf took up the tale, speaking of ancient lore and terrible revelations, that the true weight of the situation became clear. "The ring that Frodo bears," Gandalf said, his voice heavy with the burden of knowledge, "is the one ring of Sauron, master of all the rings of power. It is the instrument by which the enemy seeks to dominate all life in Middle-earth, and its very existence has been hidden from us for long ages." Faramir felt the words strike him like physical blows. Every instinct, trained by years of scholarship and governance, told him that this was truth, however terrible. Where Boromir might have demanded proof or argued the implications, Faramir found himself leaning forward with the focused attention of one seeking to understand the full scope of a problem that demanded careful solution. "The prophecy that brought you here," Elrond said, his eyes resting on Faramir with something approaching approval, "spoke of counsels to be taken stronger than Morgul spells. This is that counsel. The ring cannot be used, not even for good purposes. Its power is corruption, and it will betray any who would wield it against its maker." "Then it must be destroyed," Faramir said without hesitation, the logic as clear to him as any tactical assessment he had ever made. "Whatever the cost, whatever the difficulty, such a weapon cannot be allowed to exist." The elf, Legolas he had given his name as, nodded with visible respect. "The son of Gondor sees clearly what many would struggle to accept. The ring must indeed be unmade, though the path to such unmaking lies through shadows darker than any we have yet discussed." It was Gimli the dwarf who voiced what others seemed reluctant to say. "And who among us has the strength for such a path? The ring-bearer has already borne burdens that would crush most grown men. Must we ask him to carry this weight into the very heart of the enemy's domain?" Faramir studied the hobbit's face, seeing there a courage that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with the kind of stubborn goodness that his rangers sometimes displayed when protecting settlements too small to defend themselves. "The question," he said quietly, "is not whether Master Baggins has the strength for the task. The question is how we might best support him in it." "You speak as if the path is already decided," said the ranger. Strider, the hobbits called him, though Faramir sensed deeper names lay hidden there. "Is it not?" Faramir turned to face the group, his mind working through implications with the same methodical approach he brought to military planning. "Lord Elrond has told us the ring cannot be used. Gandalf has explained why it cannot be hidden indefinitely. Logic demands it be destroyed, and the law tells us where such destruction must take place. The path may be dark, but it is not unclear." Gandalf studied Faramir with eyes that seemed to pierce through to his very thoughts. "And would you walk such a path, son of Denethor? Would you leave the defense of your beloved Gondor to accompany a hobbit into the very maw of the enemy?" The question hung in the morning air like a blade balanced on its edge. Faramir felt the weight of his father's expectations, his brother's trust, his duty to his people, but he also felt the certainty that had driven him north against all advice and comfort. "My father sent me to seek counsel that might save Gondor," he said finally. "I believe this is that counsel. The ring's destruction serves not just the ring-bearer's quest, but the survival of everything I have sworn to protect. How can I pursue one without the other?" Elrond leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since the council had begun, something approaching satisfaction crossed his features. "Then you understand what your brother might have struggled to accept. The defense of Gondor and the destruction of the ring are not separate tasks, but different faces of the same necessity." "My brother," Faramir paused, feeling the weight of paths not taken. "My brother is a good man and a great captain, but he thinks as soldiers must think, of weapons to be wielded and strongholds to be held. I have had the luxury of thinking as scholars must think, of root causes and ultimate solutions." "And what solution do you propose?" Strider asked, his voice carrying an authority that made Faramir wonder again about hidden names and royal bloodlines. Faramir looked around the circle, seeing in each face the reflection of choices that could not be unmade. That we form a company to aid Master Baggins in his quest. Not an army that would draw the enemy's attention, but a fellowship of such diverse skills and backgrounds that whatever obstacles arise, we might have among us the means to overcome them. A fellowship, Legolas repeated, tasting the word. I would pledge my bow to such a company. And I my axe, Gimli declared, though he cast a suspicious glance at the elf as he spoke. The path will require more than weapons, Gandalf observed. It will require wisdom and courage, and the kind of loyalty that does not count the cost. Frodo had remained silent through most of the debate, but now he spoke with the quiet authority of one who had already looked into darkness and chosen to continue walking. I will take the ring to Mount Doom, though I do not know the way, and cannot promise I will have the strength to complete the task. You will not go alone, Strider said firmly. If this council decides upon such a course, you will have companions suited to the task. Faramir felt the moment crystallizing around him, the weight of decision settling into finality. Then let us speak plainly of what companions such a quest would require. Master Baggins will need protection, but not the kind that draws attention. He will need guidance through unknown lands, but also wisdom to navigate challenges that maps cannot show. He will need loyalty that does not waver when hope fails, and hope that endures when loyalty is tested to its limits. You paint a portrait of heroes from the elder days, Elrond said with gentle irony. Such companions are not easily found in these diminished times. Are they not? Faramir gestured around the circle. I see here an elf lord whose knowledge spans ages, a wizard whose wisdom has guided the wise, a dwarf whose people understand the deep places of the world, an elf whose eyes see what others miss, a ranger who knows the wild paths, and hobbits whose courage has already carried them farther from home than most men travel in a lifetime. The sun had climbed higher as they spoke, and now its light fell fully upon the center of the pavilion, illuminating the bundle that contained the instrument of so much hope and fear. Faramir looked upon it with the clear sight of one trained to see through to the heart of problems, and felt no desire to claim it for himself or his people. The ring was not a tool to be wielded. It was a disease to be cured. Then we are agreed, Elrond said, and his voice carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. A fellowship shall be formed to accompany the ring-bearer, and the path shall lead where it must lead. May the Valar grant that courage proves stronger than corruption, and that wisdom guides where strength alone would fail. As the formal council dissolved into smaller groups discussing the practical details of such an undertaking, Faramir found himself approached by Strider, whose manner had shifted subtly into something that spoke of command, accepted rather than authority assumed. You spoke well in council, the ranger said quietly. Your father's reputation for wisdom appears to run true in his bloodline. My father's wisdom is often overshadowed by his grief, Faramir replied honestly. But thank you. I confess, I find myself curious about your own background, Master Strider. There is something in your bearing that speaks of more than simple ranger service. A slight smile touched the other man's weathered features. Perhaps we shall have opportunity to speak of such things during the journey ahead. For now, it is enough to say that we share certain burdens of leadership and certain hopes for our people's survival. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Rivendell, Faramir stood once again upon the terrace where his day had begun. But now he carried with him the weight of decision made and path chosen. The dreams that had driven him north had led him to precisely the council they had promised, though not in the form he had expected. Tomorrow, He would begin a journey that would take him farther from Gondor than any member of his family had travelled in living memory. He would walk into darkness beside a hobbit who bore the most dangerous object in Middle-earth, trusting to fellowship and wisdom where armies had failed. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of choice his brother would have called madness, and exactly the kind of choice that might, against all hope and reason, actually succeed. Chapter 4. The Fellowship Departs. The morning of their departure from Rivendell dawned grey and cold, with a mist that clung to the valley like a reluctant farewell. Faramir stood in the courtyard, watching the final preparations, noting how differently this company prepared for the road compared to any military expedition he had ever led. There was no rigid hierarchy of command, no formal inspection of arms and supplies. Instead, there was something that felt more like a family preparing for a long journey, thoughtful, careful, but guided by mutual concern rather than martial discipline. "The packs are lighter than I expected," Sam Gamgee observed, hefting his burden with the practical assessment of one accustomed to carrying provisions. "Though I suppose we won't be stopping at inns along the way." Faramir smiled at the hobbit's forthright manner. In the days since the council, he had come to appreciate the groundedness that the Shire folk brought to their extraordinary circumstances. Where men might have been overwhelmed by the magnitude of their task, the hobbits approached it with the same steady competence they brought to tending gardens or managing households. "Master Samwise," Faramir said, approaching with the respectful courtesy he had learned, served him well with all manner of people. "I have been meaning to thank you for your insights about the road ahead. Your observations about travelling light and moving quietly show wisdom that many commanders would do well to heed." Sam's round face coloured slightly with pleasure. "Just common sense, Master Faramir, sir. Though I'll admit, the scale of things here makes a fellow feel a bit out of his depth." "The scale makes us all feel that way," Faramir replied honestly. "But common sense may prove our most valuable resource. Great deeds are often accomplished through the accumulation of small, practical choices." It was this approach, treating each member of the fellowship as a valuable contributor rather than a responsibility to be protected, that had already begun to shape their group's character. Where Boromir might have instinctively positioned himself as the guardian of the smaller members, Faramir found himself drawn to learn from their unique perspectives. Gandalf approached, his staff clicking against the stones of the courtyard. The wizard had spent much of the past few days in conference with Elrond, and there was something in his manner that spoke of weighty matters discussed and difficult paths chosen. "We are ready," Gandalf announced, though his eyes held the weight of knowledge he had not shared. "The road will not grow easier for our delay, and there are signs that suggest our enemies are not idle." Aragorn emerged from the shadows where he had been speaking quietly with Elrond, his weathered face set with the grim purpose Faramir had come to recognize. In the days since the council, the two men had discovered a surprising kinship, not the easy camaraderie of warriors acknowledging each other's skill, but the deeper understanding of those who carried burdens of leadership they had not sought. "The paths south are watched," Aragorn said, without preamble. "We cannot take the direct routes through the Gap of Rohan or the passes near Minas Tirith. Lord Elrond suggests we attempt the Redhorn Pass, though the season grows late for such a crossing." Faramir studied the weathered face of the ranger, noting the way responsibility sat upon his shoulders like a cloak he had learned to wear, but never found comfortable. "You speak of watched paths and enemy movements, as if you have recent intelligence. Have your people sent word?" "The rangers maintain their vigil," Aragorn replied carefully. "And there are other sources of knowledge for those who know how to read the signs. The enemy's servants grow bold, and they seem to be searching for something, or someone." Legolas and Gimli approached, their unlikely friendship already showing signs of the competitive respect that would define it. The elf moved with the fluid grace of one for whom walking was as natural as breathing, while the dwarf's stride carried the determined purpose of stone, enduring against wind and weather. "The mountain paths will test us all," Legolas observed, his keen eyes reading the sky with the skill of one born to the wild places. "But there is something to be said for roads that our enemies may not expect us to choose." "Aye," Gimli agreed, hefting his pack with satisfaction. "Let the orcs watch the easy paths. Dwarves know how to deal with mountains, and these hobbits have shown they're made of sterner stuff than their size suggests." Faramir appreciated the dwarf's directness, but more than that, he appreciated the way Gimli spoke of the hobbits as comrades rather than charges. It reflected his own growing understanding that this company's strength would come not from any single member's prowess, but from how well they learned to support each other. "Then we are agreed on the route," he said, though he addressed the group rather than assuming the right to command. "Master Frodo, how do you find your preparations? The final choice of path must be yours, as you bear the greatest burden among us." Frodo looked up from adjusting the straps of his pack, and Faramir was struck again by the weight of purpose that seemed to rest upon the hobbit's slight shoulders. There was something in those dark eyes that spoke of choices made and prices accepted, a gravity that reminded Faramir of his father in the deepest moments of his grief. "I am ready," Frodo said simply, "though I confess the mountain paths seem daunting to one accustomed to the gentle hills of the Shire." "All paths seem daunting when you cannot see their end," Faramir replied gently. "But we need only concern ourselves with the next step, and then the one after that. The rest will come as it comes." Merry and Pippin had been engaged in some private debate near the gates, but now they approached with the air of conspirators who had reached accord on some important matter of hobbit logic. "We've been discussing the matter of watches," Merry announced, with the solemnity of one presenting a carefully considered plan. "It seems to us that hobbits see differently in the dark than men, and we hear things that others might miss. We should like to contribute to the night watches, if the company will have us." Faramir found himself genuinely touched by the offer. It was exactly the kind of practical contribution that military commanders often overlooked, and exactly the kind of thinking that might make the difference between success and failure on the road ahead. "I think that is an excellent suggestion," he said, including the whole group in his response. "Each of us brings different strengths to this company, and our safety will depend on using all of them wisely." As they prepared to leave the safety of Rivendell behind, Faramir reflected on how different this departure felt from any military expedition he had ever led. There was no grand ceremony, no speeches about duty and honor. Instead, there was the quiet determination of people who understood the magnitude of their task and had chosen to face it together. Elrond appeared as they gathered at the gates, his timeless face grave, but not without hope. "You go now upon a road from which there may be no returning," he said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy and blessing. "Yet I do not think your steps are guided by chance alone. May the stars shine upon your path, and may you find strength in each other when other comforts fail." As they walked through the gates of Rivendell, leaving the last homely house behind, Faramir found himself walking beside Gandalf. The wizard's presence was both comforting and unsettling. There was wisdom there deeper than any mortal could achieve, but also burden that spoke of knowledge too heavy for easy bearing. "You have thoughts about our road ahead," Gandalf observed, not making it a question. "Many thoughts," Faramir admitted. "I find myself wondering how different this journey might have been if my brother had taken my place. he would have approached it as a military expedition, with clear chains of command and tactical objectives. I find myself thinking of it more as a pilgrimage, perhaps, a journey where the manner of travelling matters as much as the destination reached. Gandalf's weathered face creased in something that might have been approval. Your brother is a good man and a capable leader, but this task requires different virtues than those that serve in conventional warfare. The ring cannot be conquered by force of arms, nor can its bearer be protected by armor and blade alone. They walked in companionable silence for a time, the sound of their footsteps mixing with the quiet conversations of their companions. Behind them, the spires of Rivendell faded into the morning mist, and ahead stretched the wild lands where their true testing would begin. "There is something I would ask you," Faramir said eventually. "You spoke in the Council of the Ring's corruption, of how it turns all who would use it to its master's purpose. Yet you seem confident that it can be destroyed. What gives you such certainty in the face of so terrible a weapon?" Gandalf leaned heavily on his staff, and for a moment he seemed less a figure of power than an old man carrying burdens too heavy for his shoulders. "I have seen the hearts of hobbits," he said finally. "I have watched them face terrors that would break the spirits of warriors, and I have seen them choose kindness when cruelty would be easier, hope when despair would be wiser. If the ring can be unmade, it will be through such choices, not through any strength of arms." As they made their way through the valley and began the long climb toward the mountain passes, Faramir found himself observing the dynamics of their small company with the analytical eye he brought to all matters of strategy and leadership. There was something here that military manuals could not capture, a form of strength that emerged from diversity rather than uniformity, from trust rather than command. Sam walked close to Frodo, offering the steady presence of lifelong friendship. Merry and Pippin maintained their spirits through humor and curiosity, asking questions that kept the group alert to their surroundings. Legolas and Gimli had somehow transformed their cultural differences into a source of mutual interest rather than suspicion. Aragorn scouted ahead with the skill of one born to the wild roads, while Gandalf provided the deeper wisdom that put their immediate concerns into larger perspective. And in the center of it all, Frodo carried his burden with a quiet courage that reminded Faramir why they were here, what they hoped to accomplish, and what price failure would exact from all the free peoples of Middle-earth. As the sun climbed higher and they left the protected valley behind, Faramir felt the weight of the road ahead settling upon him. It would be a journey unlike any he had ever undertaken. Not a campaign with clear objectives and definable victory conditions, but a pilgrimage into darkness with only faith and fellowship to guide them. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of impossible task that might actually succeed. Chapter 5. Through Moria's shadow. The Redhorn Pass had defeated them. 3 days they had struggled against wind and snow that seemed bent on their destruction, until even Legolas admitted that the path had become impassable. Now, as they stood before the dark entrance to the mines of Moria, Faramir felt the weight of knowledge that had seemed academic becoming terribly practical. "The dwarf road through the mountains," he said quietly, studying the weathered stones that framed the hidden door. "I have read accounts of its construction, though I never thought to walk it myself." Gandalf stood before the sealed entrance, his weathered face grave with reluctance and resignation. The wizard had been silent since their retreat from the pass, and Faramir sensed that this path carried burdens beyond the obvious dangers of entering long-abandoned halls. "What manner of accounts?" Gimli asked, hope and worry warring in his voice. The dwarf had spoken little of his kinfolk in Moria. But Faramir had noted the way his hand moved to the locket he wore beneath his mail, a gesture that spoke of personal stakes beyond their mission. Faramir pulled his cloak closer against the cold wind that seemed to flow from the mountains themselves. The chronicles speak of Khazad-dûm as the greatest of the dwarf kingdoms, a realm that delved deeper and built grander than any other. The records describe halls that could house armies, bridges that spanned chasms like frozen lightning, chambers carved from living stone with skill no mortal craft could match. "You speak in past tense," Legolas observed, his keen ears catching nuances that others might miss. "The last reliable accounts date from nearly 30 years past," Faramir admitted, his scholarly honesty compelling him to speak truth, even when hope might be kinder. The messages that reached Erebor spoke of some great calamity that drove the dwarves from their ancient home. Since then, silence. Gimli's jaw tightened, but he nodded with the grim acceptance of one who had feared such news without knowing it certainly. "Aye, that matches what little word reached my people. Cousin Balin led an expedition to reclaim Moria some 25 years ago. We hoped, but hope is a fragile thing when it must survive such silence." Gandalf had been tracing patterns on the stone door, his staff glowing with soft light that revealed elven script worked into the rock itself. "The way is shut," he muttered, more to himself than to the company. "And I begin to understand why. Some doors were sealed for good reason." "Yet we must pass," Frodo said quietly, his hand moving unconsciously to the hidden burden beneath his cloak. "The other paths are watched or blocked. If this road remains open—" "If it remains open, there will be reason for that as well," Gandalf replied darkly. "But you speak truly. We have little choice but to test what welcomes await us in the dark." Faramir approached the door, studying the elven script with the careful attention he brought to all ancient texts. His knowledge of the elder tongues was not comprehensive, but years of scholarly study had given him insight into their patterns and meanings. "Speak, friend, and enter," he said slowly, translating the flowing script. "It seems a greeting more than a ward. Perhaps the door responds to courtesy rather than force." Gandalf's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something that might have been embarrassment. "Friend," he said simply, and with a grinding of stone that spoke of centuries undisturbed, the door swung open to reveal darkness that seemed to swallow their torchlight. The air that flowed from the opened passage carried scents of deep earth and worked stone. But beneath them lurked something else, the staleness of long abandonment and the faint, persistent odor of decay. Faramir breathed it in and felt his scholarly curiosity war with an instinctive understanding that some knowledge came at too high a price. "I will go first," Gandalf announced, his staff brightening to cast more light into the passage ahead. "Stay close and speak only when necessary. The halls of Moria were built to carry sound across vast distances. We do not know what ears might yet listen in the dark." As they entered the ancient road, Faramir found himself walking beside Gimli, noting how the dwarf's demeanor changed as soon as they crossed the threshold. Where before there had been worry and hope, now there was a profound sadness that seemed to emanate from the very stones around them. "You feel it too," Faramir said quietly, keeping his voice low as Gandalf had instructed. "Aye," Gimli replied, his voice thick with emotion. "The silence where there should be song, the emptiness where there should be life. These halls were not meant to be tombs." They walked for what seemed like hours through passages that spoke of craftsmanship beyond anything Faramir had imagined. The walls were smooth as glass, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the light of Gandalf's staff. pillars soared into darkness above, their capitals worked with images of trees and stars and flowing water, beauty that had been meant to last until the breaking of the world. "There," Gandalf said finally, pointing ahead to where 3 passages branched from the main road. "We must choose our path, and I confess the way grows unclear to me. It has been long since I walked these roads, and memory can deceive in the deep places." Faramir studied the 3 openings, noting the way air moved through each passage and the subtle differences in the stonework around their mouths. His rangers had taught him to read the signs that spoke of safe paths and dangerous ones, knowledge that served as well in dwarf halls as in the wild lands of Ithilien. "The left passage shows signs of recent disturbance," he observed, pointing to barely visible scratches on the stone floor. "Something heavy has been dragged through there, and not so long ago that dust has settled over the marks." "The right passage carries the scent of water," Legolas added, his elven senses more keen than any man's. "But water that has been still too long. There may be flooding, or pools where unpleasant things have learned to dwell." "Then the center path," Gimli said with decision that carried no enthusiasm. "Though I like not the way the air moves there. It speaks of great spaces ahead, halls too large for our small light to illuminate." Gandalf nodded slowly, accepting the logic even as his expression grew more troubled. "The center way leads toward the chamber of Mazarbul, if memory serves, the Hall of Records, where the dwarves kept their chronicles and their greatest treasures." "Balin's expedition would have gone there first," Gimli said, understanding passing across his weathered features. "If answers are to be found, that is where they wait." They proceeded more slowly now, awareness growing that they moved through a place where great events had unfolded, events whose nature was yet unclear, but whose weight pressed upon the very air around them. The passage opened gradually into spaces so vast that their torchlight could not reach the walls or ceiling, and their footsteps echoed with a hollow quality that spoke of emptiness beyond measure. When they finally reached the chamber of Mazarbul, it was Faramir's scholarly training that allowed him to read the story written in scattered bones and broken stone. The great hall had been a library once, its walls lined with shelves that had held the accumulated knowledge of the dwarf kingdom. Now those shelves were overturned, their contents scattered and burned, and among the debris lay evidence of a battle that had ended in horror. At the center of the chamber stood a tomb of white stone, its surface carved with runes that Gimli read with increasing despair. "Here lies Balin, son of Fundin, lord of Moria," the dwarf whispered, his voice breaking on the words. Faramir knelt beside the tomb, not from reverence alone, but from the scholar's instinct to gather what knowledge remained. Scattered near the base were fragments of parchment and stone, records that had survived the destruction through chance or deliberate preservation. As he carefully gathered what could be read, the story of Moria's final days began to emerge. "They held the passage for nearly 5 years, he said quietly, translating what he could make out from the fragmentary records. "Balin established his lordship here, and for a time the old kingdom seemed reborn. But something came from the deep places, something they could not fight or flee." "What manner of something?" Sam asked, though his voice suggested he was not certain he wanted to know the answer. Faramir studied a stone tablet, whose runes were barely legible, carved in haste by hands that shook with fear or exhaustion. The records speak of drums in the deep, of shadows that walked with flame, of a Balrog. The word fell into the chamber like a stone dropped into still water, and the silence that followed carried the weight of ancient terror. Gandalf's face had gone pale, and his staff trembled in his grip. "A Balrog," the wizard repeated, and his voice carried knowledge that others could only guess at. A demon of shadow and flame, a creature of Morgoth from the elder days. I had hoped, but hope, it seems, was vain. Before anyone could respond, the silence was broken by the sound they had all been dreading, the rhythmic beating of drums echoing from the passages behind them, growing steadily louder and more distinct, and beneath the drums, the sound of many feet moving in disciplined formation. "Orcs," Aragorn said grimly, his hand moving to his sword. "They have found our trail." The chamber that had been a place of mourning became suddenly a place of desperate strategy. Gandalf moved to examine the passages leading deeper into Moria, while Aragorn and Legolas took positions to watch the way they had come. But it was Faramir who noticed the detail that might save them, a narrow stair carved into the chamber's far wall, leading upward into darkness. "There," he said, pointing to the hidden passage. "The dwarves built their halls with multiple levels. If we can reach the upper ways, we might find paths that our pursuers do not know. Or we might trap ourselves in dead ends with no escape," Gimli replied, though his tone suggested he thought it worth the risk. The sound of approaching orcs grew louder, and with it came other sounds that spoke of creatures larger and more dangerous than the goblins of the mountains. Gandalf turned from his examination of the passages with a face that had gone grey with terrible knowledge. "We run," he said simply. "Up or down, it matters not, so long as we do not remain here to be cornered like trapped beasts." They climbed the narrow stair in desperate haste, leaving behind the tomb of Balin and the chronicles of Moria's fall. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew closer, and ahead lay only darkness, and the hope that the paths they chose would lead to light rather than deeper shadow. At the top of the stair, they found themselves in a hall whose ceiling soared into darkness beyond their sight, supported by pillars that seemed to have been carved from single stones large as towers. But there was no time to marvel at dwarfcraft, for the sounds of pursuit had followed them up the narrow stair. "The bridge of Khazad-dûm lies ahead," Gandalf said, his voice carrying a weight that spoke of choices that could not be unmade. "Beyond it, the eastern gate, and perhaps safety. But the path between here and there." He did not finish, but his meaning was clear enough. They ran through halls that had once rung with the songs of dwarf kings, past chambers whose beauty was lost in the desperate need for speed. Behind them came the sound of many feet, and ahead lay only the hope that courage and wisdom might prove stronger than the shadows that had claimed this ancient realm. But as they neared the bridge that would carry them to safety or doom, Faramir felt the weight of leadership settling upon his shoulders in a way it never had before. For in the depths of Moria, surrounded by dangers that dwarf craft and wizard wisdom had failed to overcome, he began to understand that some burdens could only be borne by those willing to stand against the darkness, regardless of the cost. Chapter 6. The Lady of Light. The golden light of Lothlorien fell upon them like a blessing after the darkness of Moria, though it could not lift the weight of grief that hung over their company like a shroud. 3 days had passed since Gandalf fell into shadow and flame, and the Fellowship moved through the Malorn groves like travellers walking through a dream half-remembered, beautiful, but somehow removed from the solid world they had known. Faramir walked among them, carrying his own burden of loss, but also the growing weight of leadership that had settled upon his shoulders when the wizard's light was extinguished. In the wild flight from Moria, when panic might have scattered them like leaves before wind, it had been his voice that held them together, his steady presence that reminded them of their purpose when grief threatened to overwhelm duty. Now, as they were led through pathways that seemed to exist between the moments of ordinary time. He found himself studying the faces of his companions with the careful attention of one who understood that their mission's success depended not on any single strength, but on maintaining the bonds that held them together as more than a collection of individuals fleeing common dangers. Sam walked close to Frodo, offering the comfort of familiar presence to one whose burden seemed to grow heavier with each step. The ring-bearer's face had grown pale and drawn since Moria, and Faramir noted the way his hand moved unconsciously to the hidden weight beneath his shirt, a gesture that spoke of burdens too great for one small frame to bear without cost. Merry and Pippin had grown quieter since Gandalf's fall, their usual chatter replaced by the subdued conversation of those learning that adventure was not always the grand thing that songs made it seem. Yet their courage held steady, and Faramir had watched them take turns walking beside Frodo when Sam needed rest, offering what comfort they could to the one who carried them all upon his shoulders. Legolas and Gimli had drawn closer together in their shared grief, the elf's usual ethereal detachment tempered by the dwarf's more earth-bound sorrow, until they seemed to balance each other like two sides of a scale weighted with loss. Aragorn walked apart, his ranger's training keeping him alert to their surroundings, while his eyes held the haunted look of one who had seen too many friends walk into shadow. The elves who guided them moved with the fluid grace of beings for whom time flowed differently, their faces marked with the timeless sorrow that came from watching ages pass and all things fade. But there was something else in their manner, a quality of expectation that suggested their arrival had been anticipated, perhaps even awaited. "The Lord and Lady will receive you," their guide announced, as they approached a great platform built among the highest branches of the Malorn trees. "But know that in their presence hearts are laid bare, and thoughts cannot be hidden. The lady sees much that others would prefer remained concealed." Faramir felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He carried no dark secrets, no hidden shames that would not bear examination, but there were wounds in his heart that he had never spoken of to any living soul. The pain of his father's growing coldness, the weight of being second-born in a house that prized firstborns above all else, the terrible knowledge that Gondor's strength failed while he was too far away to help. The Lady Galadriel stood waiting for them in a glade where starlight seemed to gather and pool like water in a silver bowl. She was tall and fair beyond the measure of mortal women, her golden hair catching and holding the light until she seemed less a person than a living flame given form. But it was her eyes that held Faramir's attention, ancient beyond counting, yet bright with intelligence that missed nothing and judged all with the clarity of one who had watched the rise and fall of kingdoms. Beside her stood Celeborn, tall and silver-haired, his presence carrying the authority of one who had ruled wisely when the world was younger. But it was clear from the first moment that power in Lorien rested primarily with the lady, and that her wisdom reached depths that even her husband could not fathom. "Be welcome, ring-bearer," Galadriel said, her voice carrying harmonies that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard it. "And be welcome, guardians and companions, who have come so far and paid so high a price for the sake of the quest that burns before you like a star in dark places." Her gaze moved among them, resting briefly on each face before moving on, and Faramir felt the weight of that attention like sunlight falling upon ground that had long been shadowed. When her eyes met his, he felt a moment of vertigo, as if he stood on the edge of a vast precipice and looked down into depths where truth waited, beautiful and terrible. "Faramir of Gondor," she said, and her voice carried recognition that went deeper than names or titles. "Son of Denethor, keeper of law, captain of rangers, brother too, one whose path lies differently than yours. You carry grief for a friend lost to shadow, and fear for a city that stands in the path of darkness, and doubt about the worth of choices that have brought you so far from home. The words struck him like gentle blows, each one finding its mark with precision that left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. Yet there was no cruelty in it, only the compassion of one who understood that truth, however painful, was sometimes the only path to healing. "I do, my lady," he replied, finding his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "I left Gondor seeking wisdom that might save my people, and I have found it. But the cost—" He could not finish, for the image of Gandalf falling into darkness was still too fresh, too raw for words. "The cost has been high," Galadriel agreed, her voice carrying sympathy that encompassed not just his loss, but the losses of all who stood in her presence. "And it will be higher still before the end. But you have also found something else, have you not? Something that your father, in his growing despair, might struggle to understand." Faramir felt the weight of her question settling into the deepest places of his heart, where he kept thoughts too dangerous to voice even to himself. "I have found," he said slowly, "that some victories cannot be won through strength alone. That wisdom and fellowship and the willingness to sacrifice for others might accomplish what armies and fortresses cannot." "And yet you struggle with doubt," the lady observed, her tone making it neither accusation nor question, but simply recognition of truth. "You wonder if the ring-bearer's quest will truly serve Gondor's need, or if you have abandoned your duty in pursuit of hope too distant to be trusted." The words hung in the starlit air between them, and Faramir felt the eyes of his companions upon him, not judging, but waiting to learn what manner of man they travelled with, what depths of commitment or doubt lay beneath his steady exterior. "I do wonder," he admitted, for he had learned that lies withered quickly in the lady's presence. "My brother would say that Gondor's need is immediate and concrete, while the ring-bearer's quest is distant and uncertain. He would argue that a true son of the stewards should be on the walls of Minas Tirith, not walking roads that lead away from home." "And what do you say?" Galadriel asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Faramir looked at Frodo, seeing in the hobbit's face the quiet courage that had carried him so far from the simple life he had known. He thought of Sam's unwavering loyalty, of Merry and Pippin's determination to see their friend's task completed, of Legolas and Gimli learning to trust across the ancient enmity of their peoples. He thought of Aragorn, carrying the weight of kingship he had not sought, and of Gandalf's sacrifice in the darkness beneath the mountains. "I say," he replied finally, "that the walls of Minas Tirith will not stand if the ring remains whole, no matter how many men guard them. I say that the ring-bearer's quest is Gondor's truest hope, even if it seems to lead away from her borders. And I say that some duties transcend the immediate call of blood and homeland." Galadriel smiled then, and it was like watching the sun rise over mountains that had stood in darkness for too long, spoken like one who has learned to see beyond the moment to the deeper patterns that shape the fate of the world. "Your father's wisdom lives in you, Faramir, son of Denethor, though it has taken a different form than he might have expected." She moved closer, and Faramir felt power emanating from her like heat from a forge, ancient strength that could have commanded armies or broken kingdoms, yet tempered by wisdom that knew when to act and when to refrain. "You wonder about your father," she said quietly, her voice pitched for his ears alone. You sense that darkness grows in him, and you fear what that darkness might make of Gondor's strength. Your fear is not unfounded. The shadow that reaches from the east finds many ways to work its will, and despair can be as effective a weapon as any sword or spear. The words confirmed fears that Faramir had carried since leaving Minas Tirith, doubts that had grown stronger with distance and time. "Can anything be done?" he asked, and his voice carried the pain of a son who loved his father, despite understanding his flaws. "Perhaps," Galadriel replied, though her tone offered no easy comfort. "Much depends on choices yet to be made, and on whether wisdom can triumph over fear when the test comes. But know this, your presence here, your commitment to this quest, may serve Gondor's need more truly than any service you could render at your father's side." She extended her hand, and in her palm lay a crystal vessel filled with water that caught and held light, like captured starshine. "This is the light of Arendil's star, set in the waters of my fountain," she said. "It will shine brightest when all other lights fail, and it may give hope where hope seems lost. Carry it, not for yourself alone, but for the sake of the one who bears the greatest burden among you." Faramir accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with it. This was not merely a token of favor, but a trust that carried implications he could barely comprehend. "And this," Galadriel added, producing from her robes a slender volume bound in leather that seemed to shift color in the starlight, "contains such lore as may serve you in dark places. The songs and stories of the elder days, the wisdom of those who walked Middle-earth when it was younger and the shadow less deep. Knowledge has ever been your strength, Faramir of Gondor. Let it continue to serve you when strength of arm might fail." As she spoke to the others, offering gifts suited to their natures and needs, Faramir found himself thinking not of the treasures he had received, but of the moment when her eyes had looked into his heart and seen there no darkness worth fearing. In that recognition, he found a kind of peace he had not known since childhood, the peace of being known completely and accepted without reservation. Later, as they rested in the guest-flet prepared for them among the Malorn branches, Faramir sat apart from the others, studying the book Galadriel had given him by the light of the crystal phial. The pages contained wisdom gathered across ages, stories of heroes who had faced darkness greater than any they could imagine and found within themselves the strength to endure. "You are troubled," Aragorn observed, settling beside him with the quiet grace of one accustomed to moving silently through dangerous places. "Not troubled," Faramir replied, though he did not look up from the page before him. "Thoughtful, perhaps. The lady's words confirmed fears I had hoped were unfounded, but they also offered hope I had not dared to imagine." "She has that gift," Aragorn agreed, "to show us truth we might prefer to avoid, but also to reveal strength we did not know we possessed." He paused, studying Faramir's profile in the crystal light. "You carry more than your share of our burden, and have done so since Moria. The others look to you for guidance, though they may not realize it themselves." Faramir finally looked up, meeting the ranger's grey eyes with his own. "Leadership was not my expectation when I left Gondor. I came seeking wisdom, not responsibility." "The two are often found together," Aragorn replied with a slight smile. "And those who would make the best leaders are usually those who do not seek the role for its own sake. Your wisdom has kept us together when grief might have scattered us. Your steadiness has given the ring-bearer strength when his own threatened to fail." They sat in companionable silence for a time, two men who carried the weight of their people's hopes in different ways, but with equal dedication. Around them, the timeless beauty of Lothlorien stretched away into silver distances, a realm where the passage of years seemed to hold less power than in the outer world. "Tomorrow we leave this place," Faramir said finally, "and the road ahead leads into darkness, darker than anything we have yet faced. Are we equal to it, do you think?" Aragorn considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I know that we are stronger together than any of us could be alone. And I know that the Lady saw something in us worth preserving, worth investing with gifts whose value we may not yet understand." As the night deepened around them, Faramir felt the weight of tomorrow's choices settling upon his shoulders like a familiar cloak. They would leave the safety of Lothlorien behind and venture once more into the wild world, carrying with them the ring that was both their greatest hope and their most terrible burden. But they would not go as they had come. The gifts of the Lady had strengthened them, her wisdom had illuminated their path, and her recognition had confirmed what Faramir had only dared to hope, that their fellowship was indeed strong enough to bear whatever trials awaited them in the darkness ahead. Chapter 7. The Breaking of the Fellowship. The great river Anduin bore them southward, through a landscape that grew steadily more desolate with each passing day. January's bitter cold had settled over Middle-earth like a shroud, and even the elven boats that carried them seemed to struggle against currents that flowed, not just with water, but with a malice that spoke of the enemy's growing influence over the lands they travelled. Faramir sat in the lead boat with Frodo and Sam, his eyes constantly scanning the riverbanks for signs of the watchers he knew must be there. 10 days had passed since they left the golden wood of Lothlorien, and with each mile the weight of their mission seemed to grow heavier, pressing down upon them all, like the grey sky that promised snow, but delivered only bitter wind. "The eastern shore shows signs of recent passage," he observed quietly, pointing toward marks that only a trained ranger's eye might notice. "Large companies, moving with purpose rather than mere patrol. They seek something specific." Sam shifted uneasily in his seat, his hand moving unconsciously toward the pack where their provisions lay carefully rationed. "And what might they be seeking, Master Faramir, if you don't mind my asking?" "Us," Frodo answered before Faramir could speak, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed too great for his small frame. "They seek the ring, and the one who bears it." The truth hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. In the days since leaving Lothlorien, Frodo had grown increasingly withdrawn, and Faramir had watched with growing concern as the burden of the ring seemed to settle more heavily upon the hobbit with each passing hour. There were moments when Frodo seemed almost to fade, as if the weight he carried was slowly consuming him from within. "We must soon make a choice," Faramir said, his voice pitched low enough that the other boats could not hear. "The river cannot carry us much farther toward our destination without taking us through territories where concealment becomes impossible. And there are signs that suggest our enemies have anticipated our route." Behind them, Aragorn guided the second boat with the skill of one born to the wild waters, while Legolas watched the skies for signs of the winged shapes that had been seen circling to the south. Gimli sat with his axe across his knees, muttering dwarf curses at the necessity of trusting his safety to elvish boatcraft and moving water. In the third boat, Merry and Pippin maintained careful watch on the western shore, their hobbit eyes sharp for dangers that others might miss. But as afternoon wore toward evening, it became clear that all their watchfulness might not be enough. The signs of pursuit had grown stronger throughout the day, and now Faramir could see the smoke of many fires rising from the hills ahead, too many and too organized to be anything but a coordinated search. "We must put into shore," he called softly to the other boats. "There, where the trees come down to the water's edge. We need counsel, and we need it before darkness falls." They drew their boats up onto a small beach sheltered by overhanging willows, and as they gathered in the fading light, Faramir could see in each face the knowledge that their journey together was approaching some kind of crisis. The easy companionship that had sustained them through so many dangers was strained now by the pressure of choices that could not be postponed much longer. "The signs are clear," Aragorn reported grimly. "We are surrounded on 3 sides, with only the river at our backs. Large companies of Uruks, moving with coordination that speaks of central command. They know we are here, and they are closing the trap." "How many?" Legolas asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would not be encouraging. "Too many," Gimli growled, hefting his axe with grim satisfaction. "But not too many for a proper fight, if we choose our ground wisely." Faramir studied the terrain around them with the analytical eye he brought to all tactical situations. The riverbank offered some protection, but it also left them pinned with no route of retreat. The hills beyond were broken and rough, offering concealment but also countless opportunities for ambush, and over it all hung the knowledge that their true mission was not to fight Uruks, but to carry the ring to its destruction. "Fighting may not serve our purpose," he said finally. "We are not here to win battles against the enemy's servants, but to accomplish a task that armies cannot complete. Perhaps it is time to consider whether our company has grown too large for the road ahead." The words fell into the gathering dusk, like stones dropped into still water, and the silence that followed carried the weight of truths that none of them had wanted to face. Frodo looked up sharply, his dark eyes meeting Faramir's with an understanding that needed no elaboration. "You think we should separate," Sam said, his voice thick with dismay. "Leave Master Frodo to carry his burden alone." "Not alone," Faramir corrected gently, "but perhaps with fewer companions, traveling by paths that armies cannot follow. The ring-bearer's true protection lies not in the strength of his guardians, but in remaining hidden from the enemy's sight." Merry and Pippin exchanged worried glances, and it was Merry who voiced what they were all thinking. "But if we separate now, with enemies all around us, how do we know we'll ever see each other again?" "We don't," Aragorn admitted, his weathered face grave in the twilight. "But Faramir speaks truly. A large company cannot move unseen through territories where the enemy's servants watch every path, and our mission has always been to serve the ring-bearer's quest, not to preserve our fellowship for its own sake." As if summoned by their discussion of separation, the sound of distant drums began to echo from the hills around them, the rhythmic beating that spoke of Uruk companies on the march. But these drums carried a different quality than any they had heard before, a coordination that suggested not random patrol, but deliberate convergence. "They know where we are," Legolas observed, his keen ears reading nuances in the sound that others could barely detect. "And they come from multiple directions at once. This is not chance encounter, but planned ambush." Faramir felt the familiar clarity that came in moments of crisis, when the luxury of extended deliberation gave way to the necessity of immediate decision. Around them, the net was tightening with methodical precision, but that very precision might offer opportunities that chaos would not. "Then we give them what they expect," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a leader of rangers, despite his father's preference for his brother. "But not in the way they expect it." He turned to Frodo, seeing in the hobbit's face the weight of burdens that no one else could fully understand. Master Baggins. You know your own heart and your own strength better than any of us. The time for pretending that choices can be postponed has passed. What does your conscience tell you about the path ahead?" Frodo was quiet for a long moment, his hand moving to the hidden weight beneath his shirt. When he spoke, his voice carried the certainty of one who had looked into darkness and made his peace with what he saw there. "The ring grows heavier with each mile we travel toward the enemy's borders," he said simply. "And I begin to understand that its weight cannot be shared, no matter how willing the hearts that would help bear it. The quest is mine to complete, and it may be that I can complete it better with fewer companions to worry about." "Then that settles it," Sam declared with the fierce loyalty that had carried him so far from the Shire. "Where Master Frodo goes, I go. No arguments, no discussion. That was decided long ago." Faramir nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Sam's unwavering devotion, even as he felt the pain of fellowship dissolving. "And the rest of us must choose how best to serve that purpose. We could attempt to draw the enemy's attention away, to lead pursuit in directions that do not threaten the true mission. Or we could attempt to break through their lines," Gimli suggested, though his tone suggested he knew this was the weaker option. "Fight our way to safety and continue as we began." "No," Aragorn said firmly. "Faramir has the right of it. Our purpose was always to serve the Ring-Bearer's quest, and if that quest is better served by separation, then separate we must." The sound of drums was growing closer now, accompanied by other sounds that spoke of large companies moving with coordinated purpose. But instead of the panic that might have gripped them weeks earlier, Faramir felt the calm that came from hard decisions accepted and plans forming with crystalline clarity. "Here is what we shall do," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command accepted rather than claimed. "Master Baggins and Master Samwise will cross the river under cover of darkness, using the eastern shore to begin their journey toward the Emyn Moil. The broken lands there offer concealment that no army could penetrate, but they demand the kind of courage that only the Ring-Bearer possesses." He turned to the others, seeing in their faces the pain of parting balanced against recognition of necessity. "The rest of us will continue down the western bank, making enough noise and leaving enough sign to convince our pursuers that the entire company travels together. When they close their trap, they will find us, but not the one they truly seek. And when they discover the deception?" Legolas asked, though his tone suggested he already understood the implications. "Then we fight," Faramir replied simply. "But by then, the Ring-Bearer will have gained precious time and distance, and perhaps we shall discover that 6 determined companions can accomplish what 9 together could not." As they made their final preparations in the darkness before dawn, Faramir found himself standing apart with Frodo, offering what counsel he could to one about to undertake a journey that no map could chart and no strategy could plan. "The lady's gift will serve you well," he said quietly, indicating the crystal phial that hung at Frodo's breast. "But remember that the greatest light comes not from any vessel, but from the choices we make when darkness seems strongest." "And if I fail?" Frodo asked, his voice barely audible above the sound of water lapping against the shore. "Then you fail having attempted what no one else could even contemplate," Faramir replied. "But I do not think you will fail, Master Baggins. I have seen the strength that lies hidden in small and quiet things, and I believe it may prove greater than all the power the enemy can command." As the first pale light of dawn crept across the water, 2 small figures slipped away into the mist that rose from the eastern shore, carrying with them the hopes and fears of all the free peoples of Middle-earth. Behind them, their companions prepared for a different kind of battle, Not the direct confrontation that Uruks expected, but the complex dance of deception and sacrifice that might, if fortune favored them, purchase time and safety for the mission that mattered most. The fellowship was broken, but perhaps in that breaking lay the seeds of a victory that unity alone could never have achieved. Chapter 8. Boromir's War. The first snow of winter fell upon Minas Tirith like a blessing that had come too late to matter. From his position on the highest tower of the citadel, Boromir watched the white flakes settle upon the city's 7 levels, transforming the ancient stones into something that might have been beautiful if his heart had been free to appreciate beauty. But beauty seemed a luxury he could no longer afford. Not with Faramir, 3 months gone, and no word of his fate. November had been the longest month of Boromir's life. December had stretched even longer. Now, as January's bitter cold settled over Gondor, he found himself counting not days, but hours since his brother's departure, each one adding weight to the fear that grew heavier in his chest like armor he could not remove. "My Lord Captain General," came the voice of Damrod from behind him, carrying the respectful formality that all the rangers had adopted since Faramir's absence left Boromir as their sole commander. The morning reports from the forward positions. Boromir accepted the leather folder without turning from his study of the city below. 3 months of bearing sole responsibility for Gondor's defense had taught him to read such reports with the analytical eye that Faramir had always brought to intelligence gathering, though it still felt like wearing clothes cut for a different man. "Increased activity along the Anduin," he read aloud, noting patterns that would have been immediately apparent to his brother. Uruk companies, moving in coordinated sweeps through the eastern lands, as if they search for something specific. "That has been the assessment of our scouts," Damrod confirmed, his weathered face creased with concern. "Large groups, well organized, but not advancing toward our borders. They seem more interested in the river roads and the paths that lead north toward the old battlefields." Boromir felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. In the weeks since Faramir's departure, he had found himself thinking increasingly like his brother, weighing implications, considering possibilities that extended beyond immediate military concerns. It was an uncomfortable skill, this tendency to see larger patterns in scattered reports, but one that command had forced upon him. What would Faramir make of this intelligence? He asked, though the question was directed as much to himself as to the ranger captain. It had become a habit of his, this internal consultation with an absent brother whose wisdom he had never fully appreciated until it was no longer available. Damrod hesitated, understanding the weight that question carried for the man who had been left to shoulder all the burdens that 2 sons had once shared. "Lord Faramir would likely note the timing," he said carefully. These search patterns began roughly when he would have reached the northern territories, and he would probably wonder what manner of prize might draw such organized attention to regions that hold little strategic value. The implication hung in the cold air between them, and Boromir felt the familiar twist of fear that accompanied any thought of his brother in danger. Faramir had ridden north, seeking prophetic counsel, but prophecies had a way of attracting attention from powers that preferred the future to remain unchanged. "Double the watch along the Anduin," Boromir commanded, his voice carrying the authority that months of solitary leadership had given him. "And send word to the beacon wardens. If these Uruk companies are indeed searching for something, we need to know immediately if that search turns toward our borders." As Damrod departed to carry out his orders, Boromir remained at the tower's edge, studying the city that had become both his charge and his burden. Minas Tirith in winter was a different place than the city he had known in summer. Starker, more austere, but also more beautiful in its way. The snow softened the harsh edges of stone and metal, making the White City live up to its name as it hadn't done in years. But beauty was a luxury he could not afford, not when every day brought fresh evidence of the shadow growing in the east. Reports from the border fortresses spoke of increased pressure, of probing attacks that tested Gondor's defenses with methodical precision. The enemy was learning, adapting, preparing for something larger than the skirmishes that had marked the past years. The sound of familiar footsteps on stone warned him of another arrival, and he turned to see his father approaching with the measured pace of one whose strength was carefully preserved for the tasks that mattered most. Denethor had aged visibly in the months since Faramir's departure, though whether from worry or from the increased burden of ruling without his more scholarly son's counsel, Boromir could not say. "The morning reports trouble you," Denethor observed, his keen eyes reading his elder son's expression with the skill that had made him a formidable steward, despite the shadow that increasingly clouded his judgment. "They suggest patterns that concern me," Boromir replied, offering the folder to his father. "The enemy's servants search for something in the northern lands, something important enough to risk exposing their movements to our scouts." Denethor studied the reports with the analytical mind that had once made him one of the wisest rulers in Gondor's history. But Boromir noted the way his father's hands trembled slightly as he read, and the manner in which his eyes seemed to see threats in every shadow and enemies behind every unconfirmed report. "Your brother," Denethor said finally, his voice carrying a weight of fear and fury that he could no longer entirely conceal. "They seek your brother, and whatever counsel he rode north to find. I should never have permitted him to undertake such a mission. The realm has need of both my sons, not just one." The words struck Boromir like physical blows, though he had heard variations of them countless times in recent weeks. His father's guilt over allowing Faramir to ride into danger had transformed into a bitter rage that colored every decision, every judgment. Where once Denethor had been cautious but wise, now he was suspicious and increasingly erratic. "Faramir rode north because duty demanded it," Boromir said firmly, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. The dreams that came to him spoke of counsel that might aid Gondor's defense. To ignore such signs would have been folly, and to heed them may have been greater folly still. Denethor snapped, his composure cracking to reveal the anguish beneath. What manner of counsel is worth the loss of the realm's finest captain? What wisdom justifies leaving Gondor weakened when her enemies gather like wolves around a wounded deer? Boromir had no answer to give, for the same questions haunted his own sleepless nights. In the long hours when sleep eluded him, he found himself wondering if he should have insisted on taking Faramir's place, regardless of the dream's apparent destination. His brother's scholarly gifts might have been better suited to interpreting prophetic riddles, but Boromir's sword arm might have kept him safer on the dangerous roads of the north. "The city's defenses require attention," he said instead, steering the conversation toward practical matters where his competence was unquestioned. "The reports from the outer walls suggest weaknesses that need addressing before spring brings renewed campaigning." Denethor's expression shifted, focusing on immediate concerns that offered refuge from the deeper fears that gnawed at them both. "What manner of weaknesses?" Boromir pulled from his cloak a detailed map of the city's fortifications, marked with his own careful notations. The months of bearing sole responsibility had forced him to develop skills he had never needed when Faramir's strategic mind was available to complement his own tactical knowledge. "The postern gates on the 4th level need reinforcement," he explained, pointing to marks on the map, "and the approaches to the lower city could be better defended with additional ballistae positioned here and here. But more importantly, We need to consider what happens if the outer defenses are breached. Evacuation plans for the civilian population, Denethor said, understanding immediately. Your brother prepared such plans last spring, but they assumed he would be here to help implement them. The pain in his father's voice was difficult to bear, made worse by the knowledge that Boromir shared it fully. Faramir's absence had created gaps in their defensive planning that went beyond mere tactical considerations. His brother's gift for logistics, his understanding of the common people's needs, his ability to inspire loyalty through wisdom rather than mere authority, all of these were missing when they might be needed most. I have been studying his plans, Boromir admitted, trying to understand the reasoning behind his recommendations. It is more complex than I had realized. Your brother sees patterns that escape the rest of us, Denethor said, his voice carrying pride and grief in equal measure. He understands that wars are won not just through strength of arms, but through the preservation of what we fight to protect. Without that understanding, he did not finish the sentence, but Boromir could supply the ending easily enough. Without Faramir's wisdom, their defense of Gondor might succeed in preserving the city's stones while failing to preserve its soul. It was a distinction his brother had always understood, better than those who thought only in terms of tactical victories and strategic positions. A commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention, and they looked down to see a company of rangers arriving at speed, their horses lathered with sweat despite the cold. The leader bore the banner of the Eastern Patrols, and his urgency spoke of a news that could not wait for normal reporting procedures. "Ill tidings," Denethor muttered, his face growing pale. "I can read it in their bearing." Within minutes, the ranger captain had climbed to their position, his weathered face grim with exhaustion and worry. He offered a formal salute before speaking, but his eyes held the weight of someone who bore news too heavy for formal protocols. "Lord Steward, Lord Boromir," he began, his voice hoarse from hard riding. "I bring word from the eastern borders. Large companies of Uruks have been seen crossing the Anduin, moving westward with organized purpose. But more concerning are the reports of other shapes moving with them. Creatures that our scouts could not identify, things that seemed to command even the Uruk chieftains." Boromir felt his blood chill as he absorbed the implications. "Moving westward," he repeated, "toward our borders. Not directly, my lord. Their path appears aimed toward the northern approaches, the roads that lead through Anorion toward—" The captain hesitated, clearly reluctant to voice his conclusion. "Toward the paths that would intercept travelers returning from the northern lands," Denethor finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "They do not move to attack our borders. They move to cut off retreat." The weight of understanding settled upon them like a stone dropped into deep water. If Faramir still lived, if he had found the counsel he sought and was attempting to return home, these enemy forces were positioned to prevent his arrival. It was a trap laid with methodical precision, designed to capture or kill anyone attempting to bring northern wisdom back to Gondor. "How long before they reach the intercept positions?" Boromir asked, his mind already shifting into the tactical calculations that had become second nature. 3 days, perhaps 4 if the weather holds," the captain replied. "But my lord, there is more. The creatures that lead them. Our scouts describe them as servants of the enemy, unlike any we have encountered. Tall, cloaked in shadow, bearing weapons that seemed to drink light itself. Nazgul." Boromir did not speak the name aloud, but he felt its weight settling into his bones like winter cold. Ringwraiths, the enemy's most terrible servants, sent to ensure that whatever counsel Faramir might have found would never reach Gondor. The fact that they moved so openly spoke of desperation or confidence that made his blood run cold. "We must act," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command, accepted rather than claimed. "If my brother lives, if he attempts to return, he must not face such enemies alone and unprepared." Denethor turned to him with eyes that held both hope and terrible fear. "What do you propose?" Boromir studied the map spread before them, seeing not just defensive positions, but the paths and possibilities that might yet save a brother lost in the north. In that moment, he felt Faramir's influence upon his thinking as clearly as if his brother stood beside him, offering the strategic wisdom that had always complemented his own tactical skills. "We ride north with a strong company," he said finally, "not to attack the enemy's forces directly, but to create confusion, to disrupt their coordination. If we can draw their attention, if we can force them to divide their strength." "You propose to sacrifice yourself for a brother who may already be dead," Denethor said, though his tone carried understanding rather than accusation. "I propose to do what Faramir would do if our positions were reversed," Boromir replied firmly. "I propose to remember that some risks are worth taking, and some duties transcend the safety of those who must perform them." As evening fell over Minas Tirith, preparations began for a mission that might be folly or heroism, depending upon circumstances beyond any mortal's control. But for the first time since Faramir's departure, Boromir felt the certainty of purpose that had always come when his brother's wisdom guided his strength. The snow continued to fall, covering the white city in a shroud that was both beautiful and ominous. And in the highest tower of the citadel, a son of the stewards prepared to ride into the darkness, carrying with him the hope that love and duty might yet prove stronger than the shadow that reached from the east. Chapter 9. The Hunt for Isengard. The deception had worked better than Faramir had dared hope. 3 days after their planned separation from the ring-bearer, his remaining company crouched among the rocks overlooking the Uruk encampment that had pursued them down the western bank of the Anduin. The enemy forces spread below them in disciplined formations that spoke of central command and coordinated purpose, but their attention was fixed entirely on the 6 companions they had cornered, or thought they had cornered. "They number at least 200, Legolas reported quietly, his keen eyes reading details in the pre-dawn darkness that escaped mortal vision. "Well armed, well organized, but gathered in a single location rather than spread for search. They believe they have found what they sought." Faramir studied the enemy camp with the analytical attention he brought to all tactical situations. The Uruks had positioned themselves with competent but unimaginative efficiency, securing the obvious approaches while leaving gaps that a smaller, more mobile force might exploit. More importantly, their concentration here meant they were not searching the eastern lands, where Frodo and Sam continued their desperate journey toward Mordor. "The question now," he said quietly, "is whether we attempt to break contact and withdraw, or whether we use this opportunity to accomplish something more significant than mere misdirection." Gimli hefted his axe with grim satisfaction. 200 Uruks in a single camp sounds like an opportunity to me. When do we attack? "We don't," Faramir replied firmly, though his tone carried explanation rather than rebuke. "Not directly. 200 to 6 are poor odds, no matter how skilled we might be. But 200 Uruks concentrated in one place represents a significant portion of Saruman's mobile forces removed from other duties." Aragorn studied the terrain with the practiced eye of one who had spent decades learning to read advantage and disadvantage in the land itself. "You have a plan," he observed, noting the way Faramir's gaze moved between the enemy camp and the broken country to the west. "The beginning of one," Faramir acknowledged. "Tell me, what do you know of the forces that Rohan might field in this region? Are there companies that might be brought to bear against such an enemy concentration?" "Possibly," Aragorn replied carefully. "Éomer leads the Iord of the Eastmark, and his riders patrol these borderlands regularly. But finding them, convincing them to coordinate with us, bringing them to this position, all of that would require time we may not have." Faramir pulled from his pack the maps and writing materials that had served him well since leaving Rivendell. His scholarly habits, which had once seemed excessive to more martial minds, now proved their worth as he began to sketch tactical assessments and strategic possibilities. "Then we must create the time we need," he said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that came from problems yielding to systematic analysis. "Master Meriadoc, Master Peregrine, your people have skills that may prove crucial here. Can hobbits move unseen in terrain that would challenge even rangers?" Merry and Pippin exchanged glances, reading in each other's faces the same grim determination that had carried them so far from the comfortable certainties of the Shire. The week since leaving Rivendell had changed them both, tempering their natural curiosity with hard-won understanding of the stakes they played for. "We can move quietly when we need to," Merry replied, his voice carrying none of the light-hearted confidence it had held months ago. "What do you need us to do?" Faramir spread his rough map on the stone before them, using charcoal to mark positions and possibilities. "If Rohan forces can be found and brought to coordinate with us, we face a choice between retreat and a battle that might accomplish more than preserving our own lives. But such coordination requires communication, and communication requires messengers who can travel unseen through hostile territory." "You want us to find Éomer's riders and convince them to attack this position," Pippin said, understanding immediately. "But how do we convince horse lords we've never met to trust the word of hobbits they've never seen?" Faramir reached into his cloak and withdrew a signet ring bearing the seal of the Rangers of Ithilien, its worn silver catching the faint starlight. "You carry my authority as captain of the Rangers, and through that authority, the alliance between Gondor and Rohan. Any captain of the Mark will recognize the seal and understand the obligations it represents." Legolas had been studying the enemy positions with the focused attention of a hunter evaluating prey. "Even if the hobbits succeed in their mission," he said quietly, "even if Rohirrim can be brought to bear against this position, we face the larger question of what such a victory accomplishes. Destroying one Uruk company serves the immediate goal of protecting the ring-bearer's path, but it does little to address the source of such forces." "Which brings us to the heart of the matter," Faramir replied, his voice carrying the weight of conclusions reached through careful thought. "Saruman of Isengard has committed significant resources to hunting something in these borderlands. The coordination and discipline of these forces speaks of direct command from Orthanc itself. If we can disrupt that command, if we can force Saruman to divert attention from the ring-bearer's true path—" "You propose to strike at Isengard directly," Aragorn said, understanding flooding his weathered features. "Not just to defeat this company, but to use their destruction as a stepping stone toward confronting their master." The audacity of the concept settled upon them like a cloak woven from equal parts hope and desperation. Isengard stood as one of the great fortresses of Middle-earth, its defenses crafted by engineering knowledge that dated back to Númenor's glory. That 6 companions might succeed where armies had failed seemed the stuff of songs rather than achievable strategy. Yet as Faramir continued to outline his reasoning, the impossible began to take on the shape of the merely improbable. His years of studying ancient lore had given him insights into Isengard's construction that pure military assessment might miss. The Tower of Orthanc was indeed impregnable, but the fortress that surrounded it had weaknesses that scholarly research had revealed. "The Ents," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. "The ancient texts speak of Isengard as having been carved from a forest, the land itself shaped to serve Saruman's purposes. But forests have guardians, and some guardians have very long memories indeed." Gimli stroked his beard thoughtfully, his dwarf wisdom recognizing the implications of what Faramir suggested. "You think to wake the Ents to anger. That is a plan that either succeeds completely or fails catastrophically, with no middle ground between triumph and disaster." "All our plans carry such risks now," Faramir replied soberly. "The Ring-Bearer's quest offers no guarantee of success, only the certainty that failure means the triumph of darkness over all the free peoples. If we are to take risks, let them be risks that might change the course of the war." As dawn approached, they refined their strategy with the careful attention that might mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Merry and Pippin would carry word to any Rohirrim forces that could be found, using Faramir's authority to request coordination against the Uruk encampment. Meanwhile, the remaining 4 would begin the delicate work of reconnaissance toward Isengard, gathering intelligence that might reveal whether the ancient guardians of Fangorn Forest could indeed be roused to reclaim their stolen lands. The separation was briefer this time than their parting from Frodo and Sam, but it carried its own weight of uncertainty. As the hobbits disappeared into the broken country, with the silent grace they had learned through necessity, Faramir felt the familiar burden of command settling upon his shoulders. He had committed them all to a path that led toward confrontation with one of the enemy's most powerful servants, based on theories gleaned from ancient texts and strategic assessments that might prove fatally flawed. "You doubt the wisdom of this course," Legolas observed, as they began their own careful movement toward the western lands. "I doubt the wisdom of every course available to us," Faramir replied honestly. "But doubt is a luxury we can no longer afford. The Ring-Bearer needs time and misdirection to accomplish his mission, and our enemies have concentrated forces that could threaten his path. If we can force them to respond to threats closer to home, then we become the hunters rather than the hunted," Aragorn finished, his understanding carrying approval for reasoning that echoed his own ranger's instincts. "And if we can wake powers that have slept since the Elder Days, we might find ourselves with allies our enemies never anticipated." The journey toward Fangorn Forest took them through lands that bore the scars of Saruman's industry. Ancient trees had been felled to feed the furnaces of Isengard, their stumps standing like broken teeth in soil that had been stripped of its covering and left to erosion. The air itself carried the taste of smoke and metal, speaking of forges that worked day and night to arm the forces gathering behind Orthancs's walls. But as they approached the eaves of the great forest, signs of older powers began to manifest. The trees that remained stood with a dignity that spoke of ages spent in patient watching, and their branches seemed to whisper secrets in languages that predated the kingdoms of men. Faramir felt the weight of ancient eyes upon them, evaluating their purpose with the slow deliberation of beings for whom mortal haste was barely comprehensible. "Something watches us," Gimli muttered, his hand moving unconsciously to his axe. "I can feel it in the very air." "Something that has watched these lands since before the kingdoms of Gondor and Rohan were founded," Faramir agreed, but his voice carried wonder rather than fear. "We stand at the edge of one of the great mysteries of Middle-earth, and perhaps at the threshold of an alliance that could change the course of this war." As if summoned by their words, a figure emerged from between the great trunks, tall, ancient, with bark-like skin and eyes that held depths of memory extending back to the world's youth. An Ent, shepherds of the trees, keeper of grudges older than most of the evils that currently plagued the world. "Little folk and tall folk," the Ent said, in a voice like wind through ancient branches, "walking at the forest's edge with purpose that burns bright as beacon fires. What brings mortals to disturb the long contemplation of the trees?" Faramir stepped forward, offering the respectful courtesy that his study of ancient lore had taught him was due to beings whose wisdom predated the kingdoms of men. "Lord of the Forest, I am Faramir of Gondor, and I come seeking alliance against one who has wronged both our peoples. Saruman of Isengard has destroyed your trees to feed his war machine, and now he threatens the free peoples with armies born from that destruction." The Ent's great head turned slowly, considering words and speaker with the deliberate care that characterized all the utterances of his kind. "Saruman," he repeated, and the name carried weight of anger so old and deep that it seemed to make the very ground tremble. "The tree killer, the forest burner. We have considered what response his crimes merit." "Then perhaps," Faramir said carefully, "the time for consideration has passed, and the time for action has arrived." Around them, the forest seemed to stir with anticipation, as if trees themselves were awakening from long slumber to hear what answer the Ent might give. The war that had begun with prophecy and dreams was about to take on dimensions that none of its participants had imagined. Chapter 10. The Siege of Minas Tirith. The great gates of Minas Tirith shuddered under the impact of Grond, the hammer of the underworld, and with each thunderous blow, Boromir felt the foundations of his world trembling. 7 days the siege had lasted, 7 days of horror that had tested every defense he had prepared, and found them wanting. The outer wall had fallen on the 3rd day. The 2nd level had been breached yesterday. Now, as the grey dawn of March the 15th broke over the Pelennor fields, the final assault on the citadel itself was beginning. From his position on the wall above the great gate, Boromir watched the vast host of Mordor spread across the field like a living shadow given form. Orcs and Uruks beyond counting, great siege towers that crept forward like moving fortresses, and above it all, the winged terror of the Nazgul, their fell cries echoing off the white stones of the city like the laughter of despair itself. "The gate will not hold much longer," reported Beregond, his weathered face grim beneath his helm. The guard of the citadel had fought with valor beyond praise, but valor alone could not turn aside the weight of numbers that pressed against them. Boromir studied the massive ram that pounded against the doors below, noting the way the ancient metal bent and buckled with each strike. In his mind, he could hear Faramir's voice, offering counsel that was no longer available, strategic wisdom that had been lost when his brother disappeared into the northern wastes 6 months past. The thought of Faramir brought fresh pain to add to the ache of wounds taken in 7 days of fighting, but also a fierce determination that burned brighter than any forge fire. "Then we fall back to the 2nd gate," he commanded, his voice carrying across the battlements with the authority that months of sole command had given him. "Fighting retreat, by companies. Make them pay for every stone." The withdrawal was conducted with the disciplined precision that Gondorian soldiers had maintained through centuries of border warfare. But Boromir could read in every face the knowledge that discipline and courage were no longer enough. The enemy's numbers seemed endless, and each level they surrendered brought the black tide closer to the citadel, where Denethor maintained his increasingly erratic vigil. It was as they reached the 4th level that the miracle occurred, though Boromir would not recognize it as such until later, when the immediate crisis of survival had passed, and he could reflect on what had seemed at the time merely the answer to a desperate prayer. The sound came first, horns blowing from the direction of the northern gate, but not the harsh clarions of Mordor. These were the clear notes of Gondorian instruments, played with skill that spoke of disciplined companies rather than desperate refugees. Then came the sight that made Boromir's heart leap in his chest, a column of rangers moving through the streets of the lower city, their weather-stained cloaks and practical arms marking them as veterans of the border wars. And at their head, mounted on a horse that bore the dust of many hard miles, rode a figure that Boromir recognized with a surge of joy so fierce it left him momentarily breathless. "Faramir!" he called, his voice carrying across the chaos of retreat and regrouping. "Brother!" Faramir looked up at the sound, his travel-worn face breaking into a grin that transformed exhaustion into something approaching radiance. He had changed in the months of his absence. There was a depth in his eyes that spoke of hardships endured and wisdom earned at great cost, but the core of who he was remained unchanged. Still the scholar who thought 3 moves ahead, still the brother whose presence had always made Boromir feel more complete. "I bring aid," Faramir called back, dismounting, even as his rangers spread out to reinforce the wavering defensive line. "The Rohirrim ride at dawn, and other allies march with them. But first, we must hold the city until relief arrives." The reunion was brief, a fierce embrace that lasted only seconds, but conveyed months of worry and relief, before the immediate demands of battle reclaimed their attention. But in those seconds, Boromir felt the return of something he had not realized he had lost. The confidence that came from fighting beside someone who understood both his strengths and his limitations, who could complement his tactical thinking with strategic wisdom. "The gate?" Faramir asked, taking in the situation with the quick assessment that had always marked his approach to crisis. "We'll fall within the hour," Boromir replied grimly. "I've prepared fallback positions, but our numbers are too few and their assault too strong. What relief do you bring?" "Theoden King rides with 6,000 spears," Faramir said, his voice carrying hope tempered with realism. "But they must break through the enemy's lines to reach us, and the field is vast. We must buy them time, and we must survive whatever the enemy sends against us before help arrives." As if summoned by their conversation, a new sound arose from the great gate below, the splintering of ancient wood finally yielding to irresistible force. Grond had done its work, and now the black tide of Mordor began pouring through the breach like water through a broken dam. "The inner defences," Boromir commanded, his voice carrying over the tumult. "Fall back to prepared positions. Fighting retreat, by the book." But as they organized the withdrawal, Faramir's presence began to make itself felt in ways that went beyond mere reinforcement. Where Boromir's preparations had focused on defensive positions and fighting retreats, Faramir's strategic mind immediately began identifying opportunities for counterattack, ways to use the enemy's confidence against them. "The Fountain Court," he said suddenly, pointing to a position that commanded the approach from the broken gate. "If we can channel their advance through that choke point, concentrate their forces where our archers can target their commanders." "It would be a massacre," Boromir agreed, understanding immediately. "But it requires someone to hold the position long enough for the trap to be set." "The Rangers can do it," Faramir replied with quiet confidence. "We've fought outnumbered before, in terrain worse than this. Give us covering fire from the upper levels, and we can hold long enough for your archers to do their work." The plan was simple in conception, but demanding in execution, requiring coordination between forces that had never fought together, and timing precise enough to thread the eye of a needle. But it had the virtue of using their limited numbers to maximum advantage, and more importantly, it offered hope of actually damaging the enemy, rather than merely delaying defeat. As they moved into position, Boromir found himself fighting beside his brother for the first time since they were young men learning sword work in their father's armory. The months apart had changed them both, but the rhythm of their cooperation remained unchanged. Faramir's strategic thinking, guiding the larger flow of battle, while Boromir's tactical brilliance managed the immediate confrontations that determined whether strategies succeeded or failed. "Behind us!" Faramir called, his sword taking an orc in the throat, while his left hand pointed toward movement in their rear. "They've found another way through." Boromir spun, his blade cutting down two Uruks who had thought to take them from behind, and felt the familiar surge of clarity that came in moments when the margin between life and death measured in heartbeats rather than hours. This was what he had been born for, not the politics of the steward's court or the administrative burdens of command, but this moment when training and courage and brotherhood combined to stand against the darkness. "The courtyard!" he shouted, indicating the position they needed to reach. "We hold there, or we don't hold at all." The fighting was fierce, beyond anything either brother had experienced, wave after wave of enemies breaking against their position, like dark water against white stone. But their plan was working. The enemy's forces were being channeled into killing zones, where Gondorian archers could target officers and drummers, disrupting the coordination that had made their assault so effective. It was during a brief lull in the assault, as both brothers caught their breath behind an overturned cart that had become their improvised fortress, that Faramir spoke of what he had found in the north. "The quest succeeded," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. "The ring is destroyed, Sauron's power broken. This assault," he gestured toward the chaos around them, "it is the rage of a defeated enemy, not the advance of certain victory." Boromir felt something in his chest that might have been relief, or vindication, or simple joy. His brother had succeeded, had found the counsel that might save not just Gondor, but all the free peoples of Middle-earth. The months of worry, the sleepless nights wondering if he had sent Faramir to his death, the weight of carrying sole responsibility for their people's defense, all of it had led to this moment of triumph, wrapped in the clothes of siege and struggle. "Father?" he asked, knowing that news of Faramir's return would reach Denethor soon, if it had not already. "I've sent word to the citadel," Faramir replied, though his expression suggested the reunion would not be without complications. "He will want to hear what I learned, and there are matters of policy that require his attention." Before Boromir could ask what his brother meant, a new sound arose from the battlefield beyond. The clear notes of Rohirrim horns played with skill and strength that spoke of cavalry charging at full gallop. The relief had come, as Faramir had promised, and the tide of battle was about to turn. "Theoden King," Faramir said with satisfaction, rising from their shelter, despite the arrows that still fell around them. "I rode with his vanguard through the night, 6,000 spears, and behind them the combined forces of all who still resist the shadow." What followed was a battle that bards would sing of for generations, the charge of the Rohirrim breaking against the enemy's lines like thunder against mountains, the combined forces of Gondor and Rohan driving the dark tide back from the White City's walls, the moment when hope returned to hearts that had almost forgotten its taste. But for Boromir, the true victory was simpler and more personal. The sight of his brother alive and whole, the knowledge that the wisdom he had sought in distant lands had indeed been found, and the understanding that whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together as they always had. as brothers whose strengths complemented rather than competed, whose loyalty to each other was matched only by their devotion to the people they served. As the sun set on the Pelennor fields, painting the grass red with more than just evening light, the brothers stood together on the walls of Minas Tirith and watched the last of Sauron's forces fleeing eastward toward the mountains. The siege was broken, the city saved, and the long war that had consumed so much of their lives was finally drawing to a close. "What comes next?" Boromir asked, his voice carrying exhaustion, but also contentment that had been missing from his life during the long months of Faramir's absence. "We rebuild," Faramir replied simply. "We mourn the fallen, we tend the wounded, and we help our people remember what it means to live in hope rather than fear. The ring is gone, the shadow lifting, but the work of peace is just beginning." Below them, the city began to stir with the tentative celebration of those who had survived unthinkable peril, and above them the first stars appeared in a sky that seemed cleaner than it had in many years. The siege of Minas Tirith was ended, but more than that, the long night of fear was finally giving way to dawn. Chapter 11. The Black Gate opens. The crown of Gondor sat heavy upon Aragorn's brow as he studied the maps spread across the table in the restored Hall of Kings. 10 days had passed since the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, 10 days of mourning the dead, tending the wounded, and preparing for what all present understood might be the final gambit of the war. Around the table stood the surviving leaders of the Free Peoples, but it was the presence of both sons of Denethor that gave this council its unique character. "The numbers are stark," Faramir was saying, his finger tracing routes on the map with the precision that had always marked his strategic thinking. "We can field perhaps 7,000 men fit for battle, drawn from the combined forces of Gondor and Rohan. Against that, our scouts estimate Sauron maintains at least 10 times that number behind the Black Gate, not counting the creatures of darkness that serve his will." Boromir stood across from his brother, his weathered face bearing new scars from the siege, but his bearing as resolute as ever. "Numbers alone have never determined the outcome of battles," he observed, "but these numbers present challenges that cannot be overcome through courage alone." King Eomer of Rohan, still bearing wounds from the charge that had broken Mordor's assault on Minas Tirith, nodded grimly. "My people have paid a heavy price already. I will not lead them into certain slaughter without purpose that extends beyond mere defiance." It was Aragorn who spoke the truth that all of them understood, but none had yet voiced. "The purpose is not victory in the conventional sense," he said, his voice carrying the weight of kingship recently assumed. "The purpose is to draw Sauron's attention, to provide distraction for a mission that even now continues in the heart of his domain." The council had been briefed on what Faramir had learned during his northern quest, the ring-bearer's desperate journey toward Mount Doom, the slim hope that the instrument of Sauron's power might yet be destroyed. It was knowledge that lent both urgency and desperation to their deliberations, for all understood that their role was not to win the war, but to ensure that others might have the chance to do so. "Then we are planning not a battle but a diversion," Legolas observed, his keen eyes reading implications that others might miss. "Our task is to be compelling enough to hold the enemy's attention, while remaining mobile enough to avoid complete annihilation." "Precisely," Faramir agreed, and Boromir felt a familiar surge of pride in his brother's ability to see through complexity to essential truth. But that presents its own tactical challenges. We must appear strong enough to threaten Mordor's borders, while actually being prepared for fighting retreat when the enemy's response proves overwhelming. Gimli hefted his axe with the grim satisfaction that had carried him through so many battles. Dwarves understand the art of making enemies pay dearly for victory. If we cannot win, we can at least ensure they remember the cost. As the discussion continued, Boromir found himself marveling at the changes the war had wrought in all of them. Aragorn had grown into the kingship that birth had bestowed, but experience had earned. His natural authority now tempered with wisdom, born from hard choices. The elf and dwarf who had once viewed each other with ancient suspicion now worked together with the easy coordination of old comrades. And his brother, Faramir, bore himself with a confidence that spoke of trials endured and wisdom gained at great cost. The approach to the Morannon offers both opportunity and danger, Faramir continued, indicating the narrow pass that led to Sauron's great fortress. The terrain favors defense, which serves our purposes if we can establish positions before the enemy's forces fully deploy. But it also limits our options for withdrawal, should retreat become necessary. Which it will, Boromir added matter-of-factly. Our goal is to hold their attention long enough for other efforts to bear fruit. That means accepting that this will be a fighting retreat from the moment we appear before their gates. Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, whose ships had brought crucial reinforcements during the siege, studied the map with the eye of one accustomed to amphibious operations. The river approach offers potential for naval support, but also the risk of being cut off if their forces move to block our retreat to the Anduin. The debate continued through the night, each leader contributing expertise born from years of warfare against the shadow. But gradually, a plan emerged that bore the mark of combined wisdom. Faramir's strategic insight, wedded to Boromir's tactical experience, Aragorn's authority binding together forces that had never fought as a unified army. "We march in 3 days," Aragorn declared as dawn light crept through the hall's high windows. 7,000 against 10 times our number, carrying the hopes of all who love the light. May we prove worthy of the trust placed in us. The preparation that followed was unlike anything in the military history of the Third Age. Not since the last alliance had the Free Peoples combined their strength in such desperate gambit, and never before had the stakes been quite so stark. This was not conquest or expansion or even conventional defense. This was the conscious choice to stake everything on a single throw of the dice, trusting that courage and sacrifice might purchase time for miracle. Boromir spent the days before departure working with the captains of Gondor, ensuring that every man understood both the plan and the likely cost of its execution. His reputation among the soldiers was such that his calm confidence in the face of impossible odds actually strengthened morale rather than undermining it. "You know we may not return," he said during one of the last briefings, his words carrying honesty rather than despair. "Every man who marches with us does so freely, understanding the price and choosing to pay it for the sake of those who come after." "We know, Lord," replied Captain Beregond, speaking for all the guards of the citadel. "But we also know that some things are worth dying for, and that sometimes the only way to serve the light is to stand against the darkness, regardless of the cost." Meanwhile, Faramir coordinated with the Rangers and the foreign auxiliaries, ensuring that their more mobile forces would be positioned to provide maximum disruption to enemy communications, while maintaining the flexibility needed for the planned withdrawal. His scholarly knowledge of Mordor's geography, combined with intelligence gathered during his northern quest, gave them advantages that pure military assessment might have missed. "The key," he explained to the assembled captains, "is to make them commit forces to positions where they cannot easily redeploy. If we can force them to spread their strength across multiple threats, we buy precious time for other efforts. The march to the Black Gate took 4 days through country that bore the scars of ages of warfare. The Dagorlad stretched before them, a plain littered with the bones of ancient battles, where the very ground seemed to whisper of futility and loss. But the army that crossed that desolate expanse carried with it something that previous forces had lacked, the unity born from shared sacrifice, and the knowledge that their cause extended beyond any single kingdom or people. On the morning of the final day, as they came within sight of the towering ramparts of the Morannon, both brothers stood together on a low hill overlooking their assembled forces. 7,000 men seemed a pitifully small force against the backdrop of Mordor's might, yet there was something in their bearing that spoke of strength greater than numbers could convey. "Do you think we will see Minas Tirith again?" Boromir asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the black towers that loomed ahead. "I think," Faramir replied thoughtfully, "that the city we might return to will be different from the one we left. The world is changing, brother. Win or lose, nothing will be quite the same." As if summoned by their words, the great gates of the Morannon began to open, revealing the vast host that Sauron had assembled for this final confrontation. Orcs and uruks in numbers beyond counting, great beasts of war that had been bred in the darkness beneath the earth, and above it all the terrible presence of the Nazgul, their fell cries echoing across the battlefield like the laughter of despair. "Signal the advance," Aragorn commanded, his voice carrying across the field with the authority of kingship earned rather than inherited. "Let the enemy see that the free peoples do not bow to shadow, no matter the odds." What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense, but rather a dance of defiance performed on the stage of history. The army of the West advanced with disciplined precision, their banners bright against the darkness of Mordor's borders, while the vast host of the enemy deployed with methodical efficiency that spoke of overwhelming confidence. The first clash came when Aragorn rode forward under a banner of parley, demanding that the mouth of Sauron account for crimes committed against the free peoples. It was theatre as much as diplomacy, designed to demonstrate courage while positioning their forces for the fighting that must inevitably follow. "So," the mouth of Sauron hissed, his voice carrying across the space between the armies like poison given form, "the little kings come to throw themselves upon the mercy of the Dark Lord. You are few, and your doom is certain. Surrender now, and your deaths may be swift." It was Boromir who answered, his voice carrying with battlefield authority that needed no amplification. "We did not march this far to surrender to servants of shadow. If Sauron wants our submission, let him come and take it." The battle that followed tested every aspect of their carefully laid plans. The enemy's forces struck with overwhelming power, wave after wave of assault, designed to crush all resistance through sheer weight of numbers. But the army of the West fought with desperate skill, using every advantage of position and coordination to exact maximum cost for every yard surrendered. Faramir's strategic positioning proved its worth as the enemy's initial assault broke against prepared defenses, while Boromir's tactical leadership ensured that each fighting retreat was conducted with discipline that preserved maximum strength for the next defensive line. Together, they waged a campaign of delay and attrition that held the enemy's attention with ironclad grip. And then, as the sun reached its zenith and the battle hung in desperate balance, something changed in the very air around them. A tremor ran through the earth, followed by a sound like distant thunder, and suddenly the great tower of Barad-dûr began to crumble against the eastern sky. "The ring," Faramir whispered, understanding flooding his face. "It is done." Across the battlefield, the forces of Mordor wavered as their master's will suddenly released its hold upon them. Orcs fled in terror. Great beasts turned upon their handlers, and the very earth seemed to shake with the death throes of power that had ruled through fear alone. The war was over. Against all odds, despite impossible circumstances, the light had triumphed over darkness. And standing together on the blood-soaked plain before the Black Gate, two brothers who had learned to combine their different strengths watched the shadow lift from Middle-earth and knew that their part in the great tale was finally complete. Chapter 12. The Return of the King. 6 months after the fall of Sauron, the White City had never looked more beautiful. The scars of siege had been healed through the combined efforts of all the free peoples, and Minas Tirith rose from the Pelennor fields like a jewel set in a crown of green. From his balcony in the Houses of Healing, now transformed into a centre for both medical care and scholarly research, Faramir looked out over the city and marvelled at how completely the world had changed. The morning sun caught the new banner that flew from the citadel's highest tower, the white tree of Gondor blooming beneath 7 stars and a crown, symbol of the restored kingdom, and the king who ruled it with wisdom, tempered by experience. Aragorn had grown into his kingship with a grace that surprised even those who had known him longest. But perhaps what surprised Faramir most was how naturally his brother had adapted to serving as the king's chief military advisor. The eastern provinces report full harvest yields for the first time in a generation, came Boromir's voice from the doorway behind him, carrying the satisfaction of one who had helped make such prosperity possible. Trade routes that were closed for decades are opening again, and the rangers report that the roads are safer than they have been in living memory. Faramir turned to greet his brother, noting how the months of peace had changed them both. Where the war years had marked Boromir with the weight of constant vigilance, peacetime service had allowed his natural humour and warmth to resurface. He bore himself now with the confidence of one who had found his proper place in the world. Not heir to a failing stewardship, but architect of a kingdom's military recovery. And the new settlements along the Anduin? Faramir asked, accepting the scroll his brother offered. Thriving beyond all expectation, Boromir replied, settling into the chair beside Faramir's desk, with the easy comfort of someone whose duties were demanding, but no longer desperate. The veterans' colonies are proving especially successful. Men who learn to fight together are learning to farm together, and their families are putting down roots in lands that were wilderness just months ago. It was one of the innovations they had developed together, using the disbanded armies not just as a peacekeeping force, but as the foundation for agricultural expansion into territories that had been abandoned during the Shadow Years. Faramir's understanding of land management and crop rotation, combined with Boromir's knowledge of how to organize and motivate large groups of men, had created settlements that were both productive and defensible. "Father would be proud," Faramir said quietly, his voice carrying the complex mixture of sorrow and satisfaction that always accompanied thoughts of Denethor. Their father had lived just long enough to see Sauron's fall and Aragorn's coronation, dying in his sleep 2 months after the victory, with the peace of one who had carried his burdens faithfully to their end. He would, Boromir agreed, understanding the weight that simple statement carried. Though I think he would be surprised by some of our innovations. The idea that former soldiers might become scholars and teachers as well as farmers would have seemed strange to him. Faramir smiled, thinking of the veterans' schools they had established in each new settlement, places where men who had learned to read maps and logistics reports during the war were now teaching those skills to farmers and craftsmen who had never thought such knowledge might be useful. It was part of a larger vision he and Aragorn had developed together, the understanding that true prosperity required not just strong borders and good harvests, but citizens capable of thinking and planning for themselves. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and both brothers rose as Éowyn of Rohan entered, her presence bringing with it the vitality and purpose that had made her recovery from the war's traumas one of its most inspiring stories. The month since the siege had transformed her from a shield maiden struggling against the constraints of her birth into a healer whose reputation was growing throughout the southern kingdoms. "My lords," she said, with the direct manner that both brothers had learned to appreciate, "I bring word from the houses. The new methods of treating war wounds that Master Faramir has developed from his research into elvish healing are showing remarkable results. We have reduced infection rates by more than half, and recovery times continue to improve." Faramir felt the familiar satisfaction that came from seeing theoretical knowledge translated into practical benefit. His months of studying with Lord Elrond had provided insights into healing that went far beyond traditional methods, and the opportunity to apply that knowledge to helping veterans recover from their service had given his scholarly pursuits a purpose that pure research could never match. "The king will be pleased to hear it," he replied. "Is there anything else the houses require?" Éowyn hesitated, and both brothers recognized the expression that indicated she had something more personal to discuss. In the month since the siege, her friendship with Faramir had deepened into something that might yet become more, though both were too careful and too aware of the complexity of their situations to rush toward conclusions that could not be unmade. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying a note of carefully controlled excitement, "there is something else. A messenger arrived this morning from the Shire. Master Samwise and Master Frodo have returned, safely, and they request the honor of your company at Bag End. It seems the hobbits wish to celebrate what they call the proper end of their adventure." The news brought genuine joy to both brothers, for the fate of the ring-bearers had remained one of their few remaining concerns. Reports had reached them of troubles in the Shire, ruffians and industrialists who had attempted to exploit the hobbits' absence. But word of their return and the resolution of those troubles promised a truly happy ending to tales that had contained too much sorrow. "We should attend," Boromir said immediately. "Those hobbits saved us all, and the least we can do is witness their celebration." "Agreed," Faramir replied, though his mind was already moving toward the implications of such a journey. "Though I suspect this may be more than simple celebration. If I read the signs correctly, other partings are approaching that will test our hearts more thoroughly than we might wish." He spoke truly, for all of them had felt the signs, the restlessness that had begun to affect Gandalf, the way Legolas looked toward the west with increasing frequency, the knowledge that Frodo bore wounds that Middle-earth could no longer heal. The ring was destroyed, and Sauron fallen, but the age was changing in ways that would require farewells from friends whose presence had become essential to their understanding of the world. The journey to the Shire took them through the recovered lands of Eriador, where spring had returned with a vigor that spoke of more than seasonal change. The very air seemed cleaner than it had during the shadow years, and the people they encountered along the way bore themselves with hope that had been absent from the world for generations. It was a reminder of how completely their victory had transformed not just the immediate crisis, but the fundamental character of life in Middle-earth. The celebration at Bag End was everything they could have hoped, a gathering that brought together all the surviving members of the Fellowship in the gentle hills of the Shire, surrounded by hobbits whose capacity for joy seemed to expand to encompass even the sorrows they had endured. Sam's wedding to Rosie Cotton provided the occasion, but the deeper purpose was the chance to see each other once more in circumstances that allowed for happiness rather than mere survival. "To the ring-bearers," Boromir proposed during the feast, raising his mug of hobbit ale with the solemnity that such a toast deserved. "To Frodo and Sam, who walked into darkness so that the rest of us might live in light." The toast was drunk with the reverence it merited, but Faramir noted the way Frodo's smile did not quite reach his eyes, the manner in which his hand moved unconsciously to his breast where the ring had once hung. Some wounds, he understood, could not be healed by time or celebration, and some victories came at prices that only the victors fully comprehended. It was later, as they walked through the party field under stars that seemed brighter than any in living memory, that Gandalf confirmed what they had all begun to suspect. "The time of the elves is ending," the wizard said quietly, his staff clicking against the path with familiar rhythm. "Rivendell and Lothlorien maintain their beauty, but they are fading as surely as leaves fall when their season passes. And there are others whose part in this tale has reached its conclusion." He did not name Frodo specifically, but all of them understood. The ring-bearer's sacrifice had been complete, and Middle-earth could no longer provide the healing his spirit required. Like the elves, he would seek the peace that lay across the western sea, beyond the circles of the world. The final parting came 3 weeks later, at the Grey Havens, where Círdan the shipwright maintained the harbour from which the last ships of the elves departed for the undying lands. The company that gathered there was smaller than the one that had celebrated in the Shire, but each member understood the weight of the moment. Gandalf would sail, his task in Middle-earth finally complete. Elrond and Galadriel would depart, their guardianship of the elven rings no longer needed, and Frodo would find the peace that the Shire could no longer provide, carried by love to shores where wounds of the spirit might finally heal. "This is not ending," Faramir said, as they made their final farewells, his scholar's understanding of time and change lending perspective to what felt like unbearable loss. "This is completion. The tale that began with prophecy and dreams has found its proper conclusion, and what follows is not sequel, but new story altogether." Frodo embraced each of them in turn, his gratitude carrying more weight than words could bear. When he came to Faramir, he paused, as if seeking words adequate to the moment. "Thank you," he said finally, "for understanding that some victories require different kinds of courage than the world usually recognizes. Your wisdom made possible what strength alone never could have achieved." As the ship disappeared beyond the western horizon, carrying with it figures who had shaped the very foundations of their world, those who remained stood together in companionable silence. The age of wonder was ending, but the age of hope was just beginning, and they were the ones who would shape it. "What now?" Sam asked, his practical hobbit nature already turning toward the future that stretched ahead. "Now we build," Aragorn replied, his voice carrying the authority of kingship tempered by friendship. "We build the world that they made possible, and we try to prove worthy of the price that was paid for our chance to do so." As they turned from the harbour toward the road that led back to their various homes and duties, Faramir walked beside his brother with the contentment of one whose life had found its proper pattern. The quest that had begun with dreams and prophecy had led him far from the path he had expected to follow, but it had brought him to understanding that would shape all his remaining years. Wisdom and force, strategy and courage, scholarship and action, all had their place in the work that lay ahead. The shadow had fallen and the light had triumphed, but the greater victory was quieter and more lasting. The knowledge that different strengths could complement rather than compete, that choices made with careful thought could reshape the world more thoroughly than decisions driven by desire alone. The road stretched ahead, leading toward futures that none of them could entirely foresee, but all of them would help create. And for the first time since the dreams had begun so many months ago in the chambers of Minas Tirith, Faramir faced that future without fear, carrying with him the understanding that some changes, however small they might seem in the moment of their making, could indeed transform the world.